Okay, good morning. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to call us to order. This is our meeting of the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency's Advisory Planning Commission. Today is Wednesday, October 11th, 2023. It is 9:34. And the first item on the agenda is the roll call to determine our quorum. I'll go to Tracy for that.
Mr. Oling,
Present.
Ms. Carr,
Good morning, I'm here.
Ms. Chandler, Mr. Drake,
Here.
Mr. Drew, Mr. Ferry,
Present.
Ms. Ferris,
Here.
Mr. Hill, Ms. Wydra,
Here.
Mr. Letton, Ms. Marolas O'Neill,
Here.
Mr. Hitchcock,
Here.
Ms. Stala,
Here.
Mr. Stephen,
Here.
Mr. Teixeira,
Good morning.
Mr. Smokey, Mr. Young. Mr. Chair, we have a quorum.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Again, thank you all for being here. I will now go over the remote meeting rules of the day. For members of the public to observe the meeting, go to trpa.gov. Under the calendar header, click on Advisory Planning Commission Meeting, Hybrid Meeting for October 11, 2023. There you will find a link to the public webinar hosted on Zoom. To address APC members directly with your comments, raise your hand in Zoom by clicking the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen at the appropriate agenda item. With your hand raised, you'll be unmuted by TRPA staff and have 3 minutes to address the APC. If you have used the dial-in numbers to join us by telephone, you can dial *9 to raise your hand and you'll be unmuted. To my fellow APC members, if you wish to speak, you can also raise your hand in Zoom. Find that icon at the bottom of your screen. Remote APC members may not use the chat box to make any comments or have sidebar conversations. Please, everyone, remember to mute your microphone unless you'd like us to hear what you're saying. Finally, I'd also like to ask remote members to turn on their cameras if they are able. I see most of you do. Okay, thank you for that. And now to the approval of the agenda. Staff, any changes to the agenda?
No, Mr. Chairman, no changes.
Thank you, Mr. Hester. We'll approve the agenda as it was posted for the record. And now on to item 3, public interest comments. If any member of the public wishes to address the Advisory Planning Commission at this time, please raise your hand by clicking the raise hand button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Or if you're in person, you may come up to the podium or by dialing *9 on your telephone and you'll be unmuted. Please keep your comments as brief and concise as possible. Any unheard comments can be submitted via email to publiccomment@trpa.gov. Please include the meeting information and agenda item in the subject line of your email. Please note APC is prohibited by law from taking immediate action on or discussing issues raised by the public that are not listed on our agenda. Let me see here. Members of the public participating via Zoom identifying themselves with an obscene, slanderous, or offensive name will not be called on to make a public comment. And I'm going to turn this over to you, Catherine, I believe, to help me with public comment.
Mr. Chair, there are no hands raised to make public comment.
Okay. And you're all set in the room? All right, sir. Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. On to item 4, disposition of minutes. We do have a draft minutes from our September 13, 2023 meeting on page 4 of our packets. Any questions, comments, corrections from APC members? Mr. Teixeira.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I see that I adjourned the meeting. I wasn't here. But I think that gives me license to vote to approve. I did read them, even though I wasn't here. Thank you.
Perhaps we can make that correction. I don't know who did adjourn the meeting. Maybe it was me. Okay. Thanks, Steve. Any other comments on the minutes? online? Everyone's looking good. Okay, I'll ask for a motion to approve the minutes.
Motion to approve.
Thank you, Kevin.
And I'll second.
Thank you, Susan. Do we need to do roll call because we have members online, Mr. Marshall?
No.
Excellent. All those in favor, please say aye. Any objections or abstentions?
Abstain.
That's Ms. Wydra.
Yeah, I was not at the meeting.
Okay, thank you, Stacy.
Thank you.
I also abstain. This is Kate Morrison. I also was not at the last meeting.
Thank you, Kate. And for the record, Mr. Drew has joined us. Morning, Jason. Okay, we're good on the minutes. On to item 5, the meat of our agenda, planning matters. Item 5A is a threshold standards update. Information can be found on page 19 of your packet. I'm going to pass it over to Mr. Dan Segan with TRPA to present on this item. Good morning, Dan.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for having me here. Members of the commission, as your chair said, my name is Dan Segan with TRPA, and it's my pleasure to present this informational item to you today. Next slide, please. So I think everyone's pretty well versed in what the thresholds are within this room, at least. But the bi-state compact established the notion of a threshold standard. And it's an environmental standard that really serves as the guiding goal for our agency, and everything that the agency and the EIP partnership does is intended to attain and maintain these threshold standards. The vast majority of our standards, we've got about 150 of them, were adopted over 40 years ago, and we've long recognized the need to update those standards. Next slide, please. So I've started including this slide when I talk about threshold standards because people often ask how we actually attain and maintain those threshold standards. And there's sort of two primary ways. We have the regional plan for our region, which establishes controls on development and guide rails that prevent degradation and often serve to encourage attainment. And then there's the active restoration program of the environmental improvement program implemented by the 80 to 100 partners that do environmental improvement projects within our region. Next slide, please. So to orient you for today, and I apologize because I do not think the arrows are actually totally sensible on this slide, but I couldn't figure it out in my head and no one else could figure it out either. But there's a number of different groups that I wanted to sort of highlight to orient you about where the proposals coming forward today came from. So first and foremost, I want to talk about in the top box, which is the blue box, are TRPA groups. So you'll find yourself in there, you'll find the TRPA governing board. So you have a formal role in recommending either approval or modification of the changes to the threshold standards, and then the governing board has a similar role in actually approving and formalizing those changes. In addition, the governing board asked the APC, over 4 years ago now, to establish a threshold update initiative stakeholder working group. So that's a working group of about 7 members. Many of you serve on it. And that's the group that oversees this entire process and has vetted a number of these proposals that you'll see before you today. The proposals themselves are from various EIP working groups that are subject matter experts on the various topics. So the 3 topics that'll be before you today are stream environment zone threshold standard, and that came through the Tahoe Watershed Improvement Group, a TYC, Tahoe Yellowcrest threshold standard, which came through the TYC Adaptive Management Working Group. And finally, 2 proposals under AIS, which is the Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinating Committee. Each of those committees are subcommittees to the Tahoe Interagency Executive Steering Committee, the TIE Steering Committee. And then finally, we have the Tahoe Science Advisory Council, which actually also serves on the Update Initiative Stakeholder Working Group, but has provided guidance throughout this process to ensure that everything we do aligns with the best science and incorporates it. Next slide, please. And so one of the early phases of the threshold update was working with the Science Advisory Council to try to develop a more holistic framework for our threshold standards. So we had initially, when they did a review, they said your standards are a mishmash of things you should be doing, things you don't want people to be doing, and your end state goals. And basically what the Science Advisory Council suggested is that you should formally define the threshold standards as your end state goals, which is basically what the compact suggested initially. But as history would have it, the compact defined threshold standards and said we needed a regional plan to attain and maintain those threshold standards. And the threshold standards themselves were adopted prior to the regional plan. So many of the original threshold standards actually contained guidance to the APC and the governing board about what we wanted to see in the regional plan itself. And we never went back and sort of altered that and created I guess, a more sensible framework to just define threshold standards as these end state goals. And so one of the first actions, this was taken about 3 years ago, many of you might have remembered, we adopted this framework formally within our regional plan and said, in the future going forward, all of our threshold standards are going to be these end state goals. Next slide, please. So the other thing we did is we formally defined what threshold standards were, is we said that all of the threshold standards need to meet at least these 3 criteria. They all needed to be specific, measurable, and outcome-based as that end state goal. So specific and measurable basically just said we weren't going to adopt threshold standards that were worded like save the whales. We actually had to define what it means to save the whales. We needed a formal number there so that everyone in this room can agree when we bring a threshold evaluation every 4 years that if we've got 100 whales in our population, there are no whales in Tahoe, and it's just a random example. But if there's 100 in the lake, is that good enough? Or do we need 200? What does success actually mean? So every threshold standard going forward will be grounded in specific and measurable criteria. Next slide, please, unless there's any questions. All right, so I'll get into the meat of the presentation then. So the first category that we looked at updating is our aquatic invasive species threshold standards. Next slide, please. So there are 7 standards today. 6 of those standards relate to control of aquatic invasive species. The first relates to prevention. Prevention means keeping them out. Next slide, please. And in the initial review, So there's 2 parts of the AIS program, control and prevention. We're focusing our efforts on the control side. Next slide. And then.
Thanks, Catherine. Quick question on that. So nothing on prevention, only control.
That's correct.
Proposal is.
Yep.
Okay.
And next slide, and I'll address that a little bit in the next slide.
Okay, thanks.
So some of the initial work we did with the Science Advisory Council, which goes by the acronym TSAC, which is what you see in the corner of the screen there, suggested that we review all of our standards relative to the criteria that we'd adopted, specific, measurable, outcome-based, and then put each of them in the system where they are. Next slide, please. And as a result of that review, so it's hardly legible on your screen there, and I apologize, but the 6 standards that are highlighted in red are the 6 control standards. So as the chairman asked earlier, are we looking at the prevention standard? Our prevention standard is no new aquatic invasive species in the lake. And that was deemed to be specific and measurable and articulated a goal of the partnership today. So we didn't review it as part of this process. We're just recommending that it is maintained as a threshold standard. But the other 6 standards related to control of aquatic invasive species in the lake, each reads something like prevent additional impacts, ecological, prevent social impacts, prevent harmful outcomes, reduce the abundance. But none of them formally defines a baseline or a way to measure any of those goals. And basically what the Science Advisory Council suggested is that The standards themselves read more like guiding principles that you would use to explain your program to a lay stakeholder, but do not serve as something that you as an organization or as a partnership can use to actually guide management and provide objective articulation of where you stand relative to your goals, because we can all disagree, like, have we reduced the abundance enough? Are we in attainment or not? So they suggested looking at those. Next slide, please. So we also, as part of this process, especially for the aquatic invasive species control, looked at how our existing performance measures related to our threshold standards. And we have two different sets of performance measures. You'll remember from that earlier slide. And we track our performance measures as a partnership through the LT Info platform. All the partners report those performance measures. There are there's three total. There's two inputs. Inputs are the actions that we take. Outputs are the immediately quantifiable outcomes of those actions. And part of this process was ensuring that everything that we are tracking and asking partners to report is ultimately relatable back to our long-term goals or those thresholds. And one of the things that was highlighted part of this process is that there was a disconnect between some of the performance measures and not quantifying immediate outcomes of those, and some not necessarily being related to the long-term goals articulated in the threshold standards. Next slide, please. So another thing that's been important throughout this process is that we not pretend that we are reinventing the wheel as we go through this. So just because we haven't updated our threshold standards in nearly 40 years doesn't mean that the discussions haven't been ongoing within the partnership about how we actively manage towards those goals. And so one of the founding principles that both this commission as well as the governing board and the interagency steering committee has endorsed as part of this process is leveraging existing work that's already been done within the space and not pretending like this is a blue sky exercise. And so when we approach the AIS coordinating committee about what the goals should be that we articulate in the threshold standards, they immediately went back to the action agenda, which lays out the framework for the AIS program over the next 20 years, and said, let's start there as our starting place, and we'll pull our goals and standards from there that ultimately we adopt. Next slide, please. And as many of you know, so the action agenda prioritizes control work on aquatic invasive plants because the methodologies are readily available to do those. And ultimately, they recommended putting forward two separate goals to be adopted as threshold standards that would articulate the direction of the program. So the first of those is that all known sites, and so it'd be all known infestations of aquatic invasive plants in Lake Tahoe and its associated tributaries and wetlands, are in the surveillance category. So what that means is that surveillance means that you can basically a dive team of 2 divers within 10 hours of work can pull every known plant, every identifiable plant from that infestation. I'm sorry, I apologize. I was stumbling a little bit there. I wanted to say eradicate the infestation, but we've specifically avoided saying eradicate within this because it's extremely hard to actually eradicate an infestation. They almost always require surveillance work. So we're continually going back to sites that we've treated down to 0 presence, but we don't call that eradication as long as there's still plants within the lake. And so the expectation is that they'll continue to do that. Brendan?
Just a quick clarifying question. So are you saying that every site outside of the Keys is in that state right now?
I'm not saying it's not in that state right now because there are active infestations. So if you think about the Keys, like the offshore complex just outside is a site that could not be treated by 2 divers within 10 hours of work.
Okay.
Is it-
Yeah, because, well, I think you're going to get to it, but I was just noticing that the proposal is focused really on the Keys. And so I am wondering about sites outside the Keys, but you're going to get to that, I think.
So, yeah, to be clear, that there's separate standards inside the keys and outside the keys. So it's a proposal to adopt two new threshold standards, each of which would be evaluated independently. And the all known sites in surveillance is directed outside the keys. And then the 75%, the standard I talk about next, 75% reduction in abundance is the standard targeted within the keys.
So my
Susan?
question would be, why are you separating the keys from the rest of the lake?
So we've done that to be consistent both with the action agenda and the results of the controlled methods test, or at least the planning for the controlled methods test within the keys. And so the all known sites in the surveillance category is a higher standard, obviously, than the 75% reduction in abundance targeted for inside the keys. But the 75% reduction is what was agreed as the goal amongst the group for the Tahoe Keys, is something that was reasonably feasible.
Okay, well, you know, the controlled methods test has now completed 2 years.
Yep.
And in the first year, in areas where herbicides were used, we were able to eradicate 90% of the weeds. And it was species specific. So the 10% that was left were the native species. So to me, this is setting very low expectations of what we will be able to do as far as eradicating species in the Keys by 2045. And that's sending a very bad message to homeowners in the Keys that are spending a hell of a lot of money right now trying to do this properly. And yet they are seeing that according to this plan, you don't expect to eradicate these weeds until 2045. And if word gets out about that, we're really going to have a hard time getting membership in the Keys to vote by November 15th to fund the 3rd year of the controlled methods test, because it'll just make them think that, hey, this is going to be going on for the next 25 years. So those were really my two concerns when I read through these standards, is that really the standards that you're setting for the Keys are really quite low, and you're doing it in such a long time span that it's discouraging for those of us that have been working on this. I think I started in 2015.
Thanks, Susan. Kim, do you want to step in here? Okay, welcome.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Kimberly Chevalier, TRPA. Hi, Susan. Many of you know I've been part of the Tahoe Keys Control Method Test Project for a few years now, and I want to explain a little bit how this came with the 75% different standard from the rest of the lake. So the current control methods test, the goal is to reduce the weed population to a 75% level to be able to maintain at that level. So in the initial first year, the different methods that were tried, the goal was to achieve a large knockback and then see over the next couple of years if that can be maintained. So you're right, 90% the first year in some of those areas. Now we're going to watch over the next 2 years with those follow-up non-chemical methods if we can achieve the 75, and that will inform the next project on which methods we're able to achieve that at least 75%. If we can get more than that, fantastic. The Keys is the largest weed infestation in the lake right now. So the goal was, with these satellite populations we have in the bigger lake, we bring all of that back to all into a surveillance, almost eradication. We're always going to be on it, but we're checking to make sure we can keep it at that. And with the infestation in the Keys, well over 100 acres, as you know, we want to achieve 75. That's a big goal. It is a long-term goal. We have to still get to the next project to see if we can maintain the entirety of the Keys under 75%. The control methods test only focuses on a few things right now. So happy to take feedback on how we bring TKPOA along in that goal. If we can achieve it before 2045, that is absolutely where we want to be. That makes sense.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, maybe more discussion on that. Yeah, do you want to jump in, Jen?
Not on the Keys.
Okay. Are we derailing you too much, Dan, or is this okay?
No, this is perfect. I was actually going to
Okay.
suggest that we take each of the 3 and take a break for questions afterwards and
Okay.
then we can go to the next.
Great. Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you, Jennifer Carr, for the record. It's interesting that, for the lake proper, you're describing it as all known sites in surveillance category. Surveillance to me implies just looking at something, but clearly it has an active component as well. If in more slides, you're gonna address that active verbiage, that's great, but I don't know if that, sort of title of the proposed threshold fully espouses what that activity is.
So I didn't actually include more slides about the surveillance category, and we have, to be honest, so we have gone through that threshold probably more than most in terms of the semantics of what we call it. I think we originally called it eradication and we thought that was misleading. Surveillance is the category that is the term they use within the management framework. The active nature of it, as you said, is they visit each site or each known infestation each year. And it's called surveillance because during that visit, when they're looking for, if to see if there's any weeds that have grown back, if they notice some, they actively remove those at the time. And it stays in the surveillance category if they can do that with, in that surveillance visit, if you will, just the regular monitoring visit. If they can remove all of the plants, then it stays in that. And if they cannot, then it moves out of that category. And it goes back into an active treatment category. But again, if there's a better way to capture that without the caveats and associated definitions that you saw in there in terms of how it works, open to that suggestion. We'll bring it back to that group. Garth?
So what's the difference between active management and surveillance?
So yeah, so surveillance means that we think it's been treated all the way down, and that you're only going back to check and see if there's any weeds that have grown back. I think active management is when are weeds present, they haven't been removed in the prior season, and you cannot remove them with the effort of 2 divers in 10 hours.
10 hours, okay.
Yeah, so if it's requiring a multi-day treatment or multiple methods, then it's moved out of the surveillance category.
So all sites originally start out in active management and then end up ideally in the surveillance category.
Correct.
Thank you.
Jennifer?
Thanks, Jennifer Carr, for the record. So, is there another threshold needed that sets a goal for the sites that have fallen out of surveillance or haven't made it to surveillance, where there's a goal stated to bring those active sites into surveillance by, such a % reduction from known baseline by such and such a time frame? Or where do they go if they've fallen out of one and they're not the keys? Who's tracking it, and what metrics are you using to bring them back?
So that if in that case or in that instance, the proposed threshold on the left-hand side would be out of attainment. So if there are multiple active infestations, so right now that threshold, the proposed threshold would be out of attainment because there are active infestations outside of the Tahoe Keys. And the idea is to bring those all into the surveillance category so that they'd be under control.
So again, Jennifer Carr, for the record, it's a, I don't want to say a lofty goal, but it's the long-term end state.
Correct.
Yeah, okay. And so is there maybe I've just lost track of what another mechanism would be to drive projects. Aside from just wanting to get everything into this category, we can't do everything everywhere with the money that we have or the participants that we have and partners that we have. So, I mean, for the ones that are to get us into attainment, do we want to improve 10% a year? Do we want to, what are our interim goals to get us to our vision for this threshold?
Kim Chevalier, for the record, I think there are interim goals laid out in the AIS action agenda. So we have an action plan of how much we want to increase as far as funding, acres treated every year. Over the last 4 years, I think we've exceeded every year the most acres treated in a year. So we're trying to increase that pace and scale basically as much as we can. So we have projects right now in the surveillance category. You know, Emerald Bay was in the surveillance category for a long time. Almost full eradication. And then a couple plants pop up because fragments come in there from however. Because of that active surveillance, now they're in there treating it and it'll be cleared again. So the goal is that you're actively surveilling all of them by the end. And you want active management. You want divers in there checking all the time because the earlier you detect it, the earlier you can get in and respond. So that's the ultimate goal, but we'll have projects in both categories for a while.
Thank you. I think that helps tie it back to the AIS action plan for me. Maybe I need more coffee. Thank you.
Yeah.
No, you're good. Could I go to the next slide quick, Garth, and then I'll go back to you, just because I think it builds off of Jennifer's question. So the other thing that came through this process, and I think goes to those interim target settings, is a revised version of the EIP performance measures used to track progress here. And one of the things that the people that actively implement projects suggested that we do is not just focus on acres treated, because acres treated often don't describe the amount of work. So the denser the infestation, the more work it requires, but also the greater benefit of that work. And so the old performance measures are really focusing on acres treated, which gives you credit for doing like light work over really large areas, as opposed to tackling the really hard stuff. So what we wanted to do is tie the acres treated to the overall abundance reduced, which gives implementers and the EIP program overall greater credit for actually reducing the greater abundance and the denser infestations around the lake, and prioritizes those. So as you're thinking about setting interim goals and how we track progress towards those interim goals, we're adding a second performance measure for the abundance reduced annually that will actually combine abundance reduced inside the Tahoe Keys. So it's a common measure that we can use both inside and outside the Keys to focus on the quality of the work that we've done and the overall contribution to the health of the lake. Sorry, Garth.
Thank you. My question is all sites in the surveillance category, is there a specific time limit that these sites will be in that category if there's no plants found? Is there like 10 years of surveillance and then after a certain amount of time, if there's no plants that are located within that site, they get dropped? Because what I end up seeing here is the potential for just a sort of rampant growth of work effort required to end up surveilling all the sites. We have new sites popping up. It just keeps on growing and no pun intended. But yeah, I just didn't know if there was like a certain limit, like after an extended period of time, if there's nothing found at a site, does it get finally dropped? Is there a different category where the site would be removed from surveillance?
Kim Chevalier for the record. I think, have you talked about the lake-wide? We will always be doing a lake-wide survey as long as there's plants in the lake. So every 3 to 5 years, we want to do a lake-wide surveillance and see where the distribution is. I would assume, if we exceeded our goals and we had very limited populations in one area of the lake, we could definitely use that to inform where we prioritize surveillance. Absolutely, we can give that feedback to the AIS team.
Yeah, thank you. I just, looking ahead, let's say 20 years from now and the lake gets warmer, we have more and more AIS. And at what point could you actually cover and surveil all the population sites? So, thank you.
Yeah, just to build on that, we're fortunate that we haven't reached that point
Yeah.
yet. Yeah, so there's sort of two different like monitoring efforts that Kim mentioned. There's surveillance, which is like going back to Emerald Bay every year. And then every 3 to 5 years, we go to a number of locations. We have established transects around the lake, about 70 of them, that the divers swim and look for new infestations. And so I'd have to get back to you on when we drop, after how many years of success we drop you from that annual surveillance monitoring, and you'd only be hit by the every 3 to 5 year lake-wide monitoring. But I mean, hopefully that's a problem we have
Mhm.
going forward. Yeah.
Dan, if I could ask Kate Morales O'Neill for the record, the 3 to 5 years, the lake wide, is that again divers, 2 divers, maximum of 10 hours for that lake wide? Is that the same standard as far as surveying?
So to clarify, that lake-wide monitoring program actually doesn't do control work. They'd send this, if there was an infestation identified, they would send other people back out there. The monitoring protocol includes both the divers and remote sensing to get a full view of the entire lake in the 3 to 5 year monitoring program. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
But sorry, just to clarify, if they did see a plant or two here or there, they would note it and then pull if it's small enough. Otherwise, they'd send a surveillance team.
Can I ask just one more clarifying question? I think about what's being talked about, but can you go back just one slide? So the first one obviously says all known sites. So what about unknown sites, which would be captured in that surveillance? Is that captured by your one prevention standard that says no new AIS? Because it's not really a new AIS, it's just a new site. Do you need anything about no new sites or no unknown sites, or I don't know?
So it's funny you ask, because we talked about wording it as the entire main lake in the surveillance category. So technically, once any survey finds an infestation, it becomes a known site. And part of the conversation we had is we couldn't evaluate the standard objectively if it included unknown sites, because then you could always say, well, maybe you don't know about this infestation and you've missed it. And, in fairness, that is true. If there was an infestation that we did not know about, then we could not control it. The idea of the overall monitoring program and surveillance program is to prevent that from happening, which is why we've included as one of the performance metrics the acres surveyed, because that is a reflection of the overall effort to getting to the state of knowing the entire state of infestations around the lake. But in terms of implementation, it would include all sites that are known now, as well as any site that is identified going forward through the monitoring programs.
And is it described that way?
It is.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Dan, can I ask again? I'm going to go back to that 3 to 5 year monitoring. So if a site has not had it during that 3 to 5, do you monitor places that there has not been any known sites or infestation, just to ensure that these areas that have never had a problem, do you look at that in the 3 to 5 year, or do you just wait until, hey, now it is a known site? Or how do you keep track of the unknown sites or the places that we haven't had an issue?
No, it's a great question again. So the 3 to 5 year monitoring program, the 70 transects that are included in that, the vast majority are sites that do not have aquatic invasive plants today. They're just established as control sites. So those are revisited every 3 to 5 years to ensure that they are still weed free. Obviously 70 transects around our lake is not a huge amount. And that's why the monitoring program is augmented with the use of remote sensing. So remote, basically aerial pictures of the lake that we can use to identify if there's areas we think we should visit because there's potentially an infestation in that area.
Great, thank you.
I'll add one other thing. This is Kim Chevalier from TRPA. That is a comprehensive lake-wide survey. We do want to do that on the entire lake, but we also have other conservation programs such as the League to Save Lake Tahoe's Eyes on the Lake program. So we have citizen science programs also with apps that people recreating the lake, if you see an infestation, you can report it and send in pictures. So we always actually have the active Eyes on the Lake to complement the science-based lake-wide every 3 to 5 years as well.
Jason?
Having reviewed the report, I'm a little confused. Do you have more slides on aquatic invasives or are these, okay? What I'm seeing is the proposed AIS threshold standards in the draft memo. And what we've talked about in our presenting here are, I'm not seeing them align. So there's 3 proposed in the memo. And there's nothing about all known sites in the surveillance category. So is this, there's also a bit of a disconnect between the proposed AIS thresholds and then the narrative that follows it in the memo. Is that an error in the memo? And what you've presented is what going to be the threshold standards?
No, so I apologize and I'll clarify, because I think it's a good point. So if you turn to page 27 of your packet, you'll see the memo that Jason's identifying. There are 3 proposed AIS standards. So the first is the one we're not touching, Brendan asked about earlier, which is to prevent the introduction of new. So the second one is no active aquatic invasive species infestations in the lake, and then it goes on to list additional areas. The definition of active provided later on is that they are in the surveillance category. So that's I apologize for representing it differently on the slide with the additional detail. It should actually say it's no active infestations in the lake. And then the final one is number 3 on as you go down that page, which is the 75% reduction in abundance within the Tahoe Keys.
Okay, I think that gets at some of the questions. Is the surveillance term, I think, is throwing people off. The idea is we want no active sites in the lake. That's the threshold standard.
Correct.
How we go about monitoring that and addressing it, that's going to be dealt with in the control measures. Okay.
Since you have no new AIS slides, I'm going to ask another. So I know you talk about in the memo how these standards are only focused on plants, and it just seems, and you talk about why you can't, Asian clam and now New Zealand mud snail and now talk about crayfish. It just seems like we're doing a disservice to have nothing on anything but plants. It's just because there's no eradication methods, there's no treatment methods, right? Do we need a standard that says develop eradication methods for Asian clams, or it seems like we're really missing something here.
So I think a lot of the other species, first I'll start with, back in 2015, we had the members of the Science Council produce an implementation plan that informed how we prioritize control. And it went through all of the different species and basically where you should implement resources to kind of get your best bang for your buck on getting control. The 2 plant species we have in here now, we still have the opportunity to achieve these goals. Like you said, with the other species, they're less likely. It doesn't mean we're not going to address them. We have them in the AIS action agenda, and we'll prioritize those as we get funding and get more of a control on the plants. But I think in the 20-year timeframe that we're looking at, plants will be the priority.
Is that good enough? Yeah.
We'll leave it to your judgment as to whether or not it's good enough. But remember, thresholds are just one place to put policies regarding aquatic invasive species. So, if there's a desire to add some policy direction in the regional plan or some, in code or something like that, there's also places that you can have articulation of that policy direction as well, not just in
Thresholds are kind of it seems like a nice place to have something, because then you have that feedback metric. It's evaluated every 4 years. How are we doing? How are we adapting? If it's just in a plan and we're hoping for funding, or I don't know. I'd be interested to hear what my colleagues think about that. But Dan, I don't know. Do you want to? Where should we go? Yeah, Mr. Hester, and then we'll go to Drew.
Yeah, this was a topic on feedback and performance measurement and everything that came up from the board at their retreat. And one of the concepts we've been talking about internally is you do have thresholds, you have goals and policies, you have code provisions, you have projects that are in the EIP, projects that are private development. And then you should, what the board would like is you should report on the progress you're making through all of those actions and report back every year. So to reinforce John Marshall's point, we can measure how well we're doing on a policy just as easily as we can, well, maybe more easily depending on the policy, or more difficult than we can at threshold. But the point is, the board has asked us to start doing more measurement and more regular reporting on what we're doing. So that may help your discussion.
My last comment would just be on the proposed threshold standards. The first one, I think we need to think about how it's written. I know that's a carryover from what was there previously, but to me, the prevent the introduction, that's the active wording in the document. The threshold standard should be no new aquatic invasives. The rest of that could be moved to control measures. Because the bottom line is that we don't want any new aquatic invasives in the basin or in the lake. So I think you just need to reword that. I wouldn't carry over the previous one as written. I would make that change. I think the second one gets at the major elements that a lot of the comments this morning were related to. I think that it's a pretty loaded standard. There's a lot in there. I don't know if you want to break that out into two. I mean, given the conversation we had this morning, maybe it covers the way it needs to be written to address that. But those, I think simplifying them to 3 is fine, making sure that it's clear what we're trying to achieve with them. And then I would make that change to number 1.
Ms. Carr, go ahead. No, I was just calling on folks.
The challenge that first proposed threshold is going to charge you with now is that we have now failed because we have the new snail. So at what point does that standard then become back in attainment? I mean, is there a time scale where we have no new, and I completely agree with you, Drew. I think it needs to be reworded a little bit, but then what constitutes achievement when we have had a new AIS species come into play, and then that species, I guess, moves into a different category? But when does new expire and then you're back in attainment again? So I don't know if it's completely time scale and measurable quite yet. Thank you for bringing up the non-plant species too, because that was my next question. It may not be ripe for a threshold yet, but I do think we want to memorialize it somewhere so we don't lose track of the importance of that. And if it's already in pieces, here and there, that's great. Maybe summarizing those pieces in an overall concept for the non-plant species would be good. And or potentially, charge the Science Advisory Council with helping on this threshold for the non-plant species, and seeing maybe how it interwebs with other water quality issues. Are the presence of these other non-plant species affecting nutrients, affecting clarity, affecting the experience of being in the lake and not stepping on clamshells, things like that. So, we've talked a little bit in the TSAC about how all of these thresholds they're not single things. They're really, they need a better conceptual model as to how each is connected. And, maybe there's an opportunity here to charge someone with something about the non-plant species.
Thanks, Jennifer. Other comments on this? Ellery?
There it goes. There it goes. Thanks, Mr. Chair. Sorry about that. I think I just wanted to pick up the thread of the conversation that Brendan, you started, and then Jennifer Carr continued. I think AIS is a little bit misleading if it's just going to focus on plants. I would prefer the threshold just be specific to say aquatic invasive plants. Because if one of the standards is no new infestations or no new introductions, it makes you think that that includes non-plants as well. So I think it's overly broad the way that it is. I'd like to say I wouldn't promote that. I'm not for that idea. I just think it's more clear. I think I'm more for the idea of including other invasive species. I know that our agency, NDSL, worked really closely with TRPA to implement bottom barriers in Sand Harbor for the treatment of Asian clams. So I do think that there are some treatment methods out there. We're currently monitoring the effectiveness of that treatment, and it's showing to be pretty effective. The jury's still out because we're still monitoring, but so far the results are looking good. I wanted to make that point. I think it's important to include them. And I think it's important to include them as a threshold as well. I think the reason why is because it helps to show the continuity of projects implemented on the ground, our funding, our effort, how it all helps to contribute towards threshold attainment. We're working with TRPA right now on a forest health grant, and we are including the vegetation threshold that we're trying to help achieve. So it just helped to show that linkage and the continuity.
Thanks, Hillary. Dan, do you want to respond?
Yeah, not so much as a response, but more just to provide context on it. So one of the things that members of the TUI SWIG know is that we've had sort of active conversations about what we do with things that we're working on that are not ripe for specific and measurable target setting. And also with the mindset that the threshold standards, earlier we said they're supposed to be smart as well, meaning that, you know, like we think they should be potentially achievable as well. Like we're not just setting things that are pie in the sky. And that's, you know, that's a requirement of the compact that the regional plan can actually attain and maintain the thresholds. And so that the conversation is actually has expanded beyond just AIS within that and with the Science Council into realms like nearshore clarity or microplastics in the water column, where they're thinking, you know, we know we want to preserve nearshore clarity. It's very hard to put a number on what we want it to be. Same things like we know we prefer fewer microplastics in the water column. It's very hard, and it's not just TRPA, it's, you know, agencies around the country are wrestling with what is an appropriate target to preserve, you know, human health, to preserve the health of species within your environment. And I think when we're talking about the thresholds for specifically for AIS, because you're right, the thresholds themselves are focused on plants. And specifically reference plants. Other than the first one, the prevention one includes all species. So it is, we're trying to prevent any new aquatic invader, whether it be a plant or otherwise, from entering the lake. But you can see it's also something the coordinating committee wrestled with because the EIP performance measures for that feed up to this include work for things like clams. So if they're treating area for clams and they're reducing abundance, those would be counted in the performance measures to give people credit for it, acknowledging that we're still trying to do work on them and identify control measures that work, but we're not quite ready yet to set a target that we could objectively evaluate that we think we can achieve. And so, you know, like one of the things that the Science Council suggested is that we have an overall statement of intent that would say something, you know, like to capture all the things that we're trying to do. Like we're trying to reduce all species, whether, you know, all invasive species that are present within the lake, and we're trying to reduce their impacts, whether or not there is a viable control measure today And part of the discussions we've had is, okay, where does that now live within our system? So John Marshall alluded to it earlier. Should that become a goal and policy within the regional plan that's then potentially a predecessor to a threshold standard specifically related to Asian clams? That's something that we have struggled with, and admittedly, it seems like the direction of the committee is that we should continue to look at that to ensure that that intent is actually captured somewhere.
I definitely think so. Yeah. I think you need some concrete place to point at things like, we don't want the known invasive species to expand. We want to develop eradication methods to eliminate them. I think those things are incredibly important to the public, to the lake, to all of us. So rather than, we should put those somewhere, I think, I think I'd like to hear, yeah, we got together and thought about this, and we think this is a meaningful spot to put these, and the governing board's going to ask about those on a yearly basis. And I think that's really important.
Can I just add something? As far as the wording of the proposed AIS threshold standards, I'd really like to see both number 2 and number 3 reworded. The way number 2 reads, no active aquatic invasive plant infestations in Lake Tahoe, not including the Tahoe Keys. Well, to me, that reads like we've given up on the Tahoe Keys. And I think that that's sending a very bad message out if we say that, we're not dealing with the Tahoe Keys. And also that number 2 has absolutely no timeline attached to it. When do we want that to occur by? So I'd really like to get rid of not including the Tahoe Keys. And I really think that we can have a threshold met sooner than 2045. That's just too far in the future. Thank you.
One thing that I'll add is I think it's important that thresholds get set. If it's important to the ecological integrity of the lake, the threshold gets set, the future condition that we need to achieve. Even if we know that we're not in compliance or in attainment of that, I think it's important that the public sees report cards and threshold evaluation reports coming out showing that we're not there yet. We're meeting this, we're meeting that. There's successes to celebrate, but there's also gaps. And some of that's, we don't have the management approaches yet that are demonstrated to work to get there, but we know we need to get to this outcome. So picking up on what Brendan brought up, I think it is important to signal to the public that it isn't just plants. Like the AIS equation includes the clams and the living, what do we call them, not plants. Yeah, and I totally understand where you're coming from, that there's been less work done in that area, and it's a lower priority in the grand scheme of things. Not everything can be a top priority just because it's a threshold, but the thresholds are there to set the end state that we need to achieve. So it should, and then the management planning and can be clear and updated regularly to say, this is still a lower tier. We don't have the funding. We're working on this. There's still science gaps in our understanding. I guess my bigger point is it's okay to set some thresholds that are a little bit ambitious, but important, even if we're not completely clear on how we're getting there yet.
Thanks, Kevin. Garth?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kevin, I completely agree with you. And I think that the proposed AIS threshold standard number 2, I think it would be good to reword it to remove the word plant and replace it with species. So no active aquatic invasive species infestations in Lake Tahoe. And I think that would probably capture what you're saying. I mean, while it doesn't outright say, the specific other species, because there may be some others that aren't here yet that we don't know about. Sorry to be gloomy and doomy, but I think just being a little more general on that might be good.
When you're all debating these, I think this is a fabulous exercise of all your judgments and perspectives, but also keep in mind how thresholds work and why, like the original thresholds, there's a threshold study report that was done that describes kind of intent and to some extent and why one number was chosen over another number, or, you know, and we all wish it was more, you know, at times more descriptive than it is. But that kind of background didn't get put into the thresholds because thresholds become regulatory language. And what you don't want to do is create an unachievable outcome that all of a sudden becomes something that you're obligated to obtain. And how that can then be used by a variety of interests to drive spending, prioritization, you know, then so I guess be careful of the unintended consequences of setting a threshold that doesn't have the SMART criteria really behind it. And that's hopefully what we can guide you and help you do. But just keep that in kind of in the back of your mind that 5 years after we make these, you know, adopt these, this language, how it might be either implemented or utilized from a variety of different stakeholders. Not that that's not a reason not to do something that is appropriate, but just in your consideration of the range of options that you have, how that might be, you know, what are the unintended consequences, or, you know, how that, you know, what does that set up the agency for when we're doing a regional plan amendments, or because we have to make findings every time that we amend the code and the regional plan, that the code and regional plan attain and maintain thresholds. And if we don't have a program on Asian clams to say, here's how we're going to attain and maintain thresholds, then our regional plan is unacceptable. You know, we can explain, you know, it's just not achievable or whatever it is at the moment, but that has real consequences that you, I think, need to just figure out how that works into your, you know, discussions about what our objectives should be and where those objectives should live. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Yeah, that's
Chairman.
good. Steve, yeah.
Thank you. For the record, Steve Chair. So thank you for saying that, John, because that kind of was swirling around in my head. However, I think the members who are commenting on this have raised an issue that probably somebody who, when we go on pilgrimages for money, somebody's going to say, hey, do you have a plan for that part? And I think the recent discovery of New Zealand snails, you know, is going to highlight that. So is there something between a threshold standard and not having adequate answers for some of the questions that come up in this forum? Is there something in between that we could write up that would give this group and others, you know, the sense that it's not that we went over that because we didn't have a plan or money to get there, but we need to quantify where this should live, as Mr. Marshall said. Maybe it doesn't live in the thresholds, but it needs to live somewhere significant.
I'll go back to what I probably didn't explain very well a few minutes ago. As recently as yesterday afternoon, Dan and I were chatting about what's a threshold, what's a goal in the regional plan and a policy. And back to what the board said, we want to know how those pieces work together, and we want it measured and we want it reported on. So that's what we're working on, Steve. And I think your input here will, you know, with the caution John gave, well, maybe we don't make that a threshold, but we make it a policy, and here's what programs are happening through the EIP, or what regulations we put in place, or whatever. But you're right, we need to capture it somewhere in that system: thresholds, goals, policies, code, you know, how we spend the money, how we review private development and report on it. So I hope that answers your question. It's a conceptual.
Can I ask a clarifier on that? So
Sure.
thresholds become regulatory is what you said, but is a goal in the regional plan not regulatory, or what's the difference there?
Yes, it is. I mean, a regional plan goal or policy is regulatory in its own sense. I mean, we're almost leapfrogging ahead to planning 102. When we talk about this, so we'll, this, yes. But it's a different type of, our whole structure is set towards achieving and maintaining thresholds. That's the prime directive of the compact. Once you set them, you need to achieve and maintain those thresholds. So it's in a regional plan, like I said, has those requirements to attain and maintain those thresholds. But they also can be broader than, just specific programs to accomplish those things. So you might have, a policy that's related to, your desire to maintain an AIS-free lake. That's the ultimate objective. That's something that, can belong someplace else where the significance of that statement is appropriate for its location. So that's, and that's not always the same in each circumstance.
Right, we're trying to almost thread a needle here where we have these lofty desires, right? But we don't want to insert them in places that, I don't want to say get us in trouble, but that are totally unachievable and we just set ourselves up to fail, right? So, but we also just don't want to bury it in some policy language where it becomes semi-meaningless. I mean, we have a lot of policies too that we just don't implement, unfortunately, but where is that spot? Maybe you can think about that and we can have a further discussion. I know we're taking quite a bit of your time right here, and I know we have other thresholds to talk about. This one's really important. Kim?
Yeah, I'll just follow up on that. I think it will help to show all of the interim goals that we have in place that lead up to the ultimate thresholds. And we do have those. Currently, a lot of them are in the AIS action agenda. And I think showing the overall picture there, you all can look at and see where the appropriate place is, including the keys too. We have a lot of interim goals for the keys, and it's not just 2045. So I think on our next presentation, we can kind of show that those interim goals, where they are in our current plans, and if they're in the right place. Same with Ellery, I'm glad you brought up Sand Harbor. Like for Asian clams, that was a really important project. Our current goal with Asian clams is to eradicate in iconic places. So Sand Harbor, Emerald Bay, we want eradication in those places. We know we can't probably achieve eradication lake-wide, but can we get specific places we want eradication? So we can show you those kind of goals that the coordinating committee has looked at.
Jason?
So given the conversation we just had, I don't know how threshold standards 1 and 2 as proposed are practical. Well, given what John just shared and the discussion we just had about are there these things that set the agency and the region up for that they can't be achieved? Well, the reality of no new aquatic invasive species would be great. We just had one happen. So, and it's going to happen again. It's inevitable. But that, so this gets to the whole of what are we trying to do with the standard? Because if our goal or the standard we want to achieve is no new aquatic invasive species, I think that's great. But if we know that we don't have total control of that. And so we've just demonstrated that we don't, because it's happened again, and it will likely happen again at some point in the future. So I guess it gets to your point, John, of, okay, then I'm not sure what we're doing with the standards, because I don't think 1 and 2 are practical. There's, given the size of the lake and the volume of water and the areas, there's likely to be active aquatic invasive plants somewhere in the lake moving forward. Unless we can scan on a regular basis the entirety of the lake, I don't know how you achieve 1 or 2. So I personally would want that to be what we're aiming for, but I guess, John, to your point, I'm not sure how we do that. And I'm now confused that. Not confused, but I think we have some things to think about with what we set as standards.
I think I agree with a lot of what you said in that, but there are, I mean, I didn't mean to be a wet blanket, but, so think about water quality for a minute. You know, we have water quality centers that, you know, says by, you know, achieve, you know, clarity of a certain level by, you know, and do we even have a date by a certain date? And that drives a lot of programs. There's probably a lot that we don't have the ability to control in that water quality equation. And so we have to react to that. Just because there's things out of our control, climate change, I don't think means that we necessarily throw our hands up at a threshold that is pretty ambitious. And yes, we may be in non-attainment, and that may have certain circumstances. You know, we've gradually moved over time from, you know, thresholds from non-attainment to attainment. Sometimes, you know, our monitor indicates that we slip out of attainment, and that drives, you know, efforts to be focused on, you know, those areas of non-attainment. Dan, I don't know if you want to add anything more, but I see like goal number 1, which is an existing policy. So if you want to take it out, then all of a sudden we're backing off that as different than how you want to frame a new goal. And it may be that, you know, you want to take a serious look at some of those thresholds that, you know, present very difficult, challenging objectives, and whether or not the line is put in the right place for, you know, or the criteria is placed in the right location. You know, is that achievable? Yes, but it's going to be difficult. It's going to take us 60 years to get, you know, plus to get to water quality objectives. So I don't know if that's helpful or distinguishes some of this.
Thank you, John, for that. I think that that's exactly the reason why all species need to be included, because this is going to be a difficult, challenging objective. It's going to take a long time. And I think leaving out the other species and only having plants included is not the correct way forward. Exactly how it's done, I mean, that can be determined, but I think that it's important to have that included here. And I understand your concern about the potential for other, you know, agencies or stakeholders, how they may respond to something like that, because it is so difficult to do. And it may be, you know, used against us, and it's a lofty goal. It's going to take some time, but I think it's really to maintain the ecological integrity of the lake. It's important to have these other species included.
Thanks, Garth. I know Jennifer wants to jump in. Is it timely response right now, or do you want to take one more? Okay, Jennifer.
So this has been really good discussion. Poor Dan looks a bit shell-shocked over there. Because we've had doom and gloom. I made a broad statement that we have failed, you know, because of the snail, and, you know, there's a lot of discussion about, you know, what's the right thing. So clearly, at least to me, it seems like, you know, as the chair of the TUISWIG, maybe we should convene a meeting to talk about this threshold, and because it's not an action item today, right? It was informational. Yeah. So yeah, I think it'd be good to continue this discussion in the TUISWIG, the stakeholder working group forum, and see where it leads. I'm offering that anyway, if that's a desire of the TRPA.
Could be a soft landing spot. What is your, well, I'll ask and you don't have to answer right now, but what's your timeline? Like, what's the horizon here? What step is this in your process? You'll probably tell us that later, but you don't have to answer that now, but
I mean,
I
I
don't
think
want to
that
set you back
depends on
too
some of the
much.
direction we get today. Can I jump in on the all species Because I think that
Please.
it is a discussion we've had at 2 East Week before, and maybe we need to bring it back. But as John mentioned, so that to change the regional plan, we need to make findings that say it's sufficient to attain and maintain all thresholds. And so, as you know, there's a number of non-native species in the lake. So, there's mysis shrimp, there's crayfish, there's kokanee. And if we include all, it means that we have to make findings that we have a reasonable plan to achieve that. And I think that that's sort of the difference. Jason sort of highlighted it earlier of, can we actually achieve these? And I think the difference for the top two is that we actually do have plans to achieve those. And yes, the first one maybe didn't work, and maybe we need more outreach to non-motorized, or we need more outreach to anglers to beef up that program to prevent an additional species. But I think that still is our goal, and we're looking at making those changes now. And we do have that, we have a plan in place, and we're looking to beef that up. I think the same thing for number 2, for the no active plant infestations. That is the plan laid out in the action agenda today. And, that action agenda is not fully funded. We're about halfway there right now. But the intent is, if that's fully funded, that we could achieve that goal and hopefully maintain it long term. And I think that's somewhat, at least in my mind, that separates the things that we actually know and have a plan to do from the things that we are still working on and still trying to figure out what our end goal, not trying to figure out what our end goal should be, because I think you're right. We know what the end goal should be. We're still trying to figure out the strategy to get to that end goal. And, some of that is science, some of it is funding, some of it is other things, but we're still working that through. And I think the intent is, once we develop that, then it moves to this threshold category. And at least in my mind, the open question that Jennifer raised for 2 East Wig is, where do those things land in advance of us being ready to establish that specific and measurable target? Because I think I fear, we have a number of thresholds today that we put out the threshold evaluation report every 4 years. And, often it's, I won't say ridiculed by other agencies, but other agencies don't always look highly upon it. And because it says, okay, you're out of attainment again. There's still, and my fear is that we say something like no invasives in the lake, and we set ourselves up for a report that every 4 years it comes back and we report to you, yep, still invasives in the lake, still invasives in the lake. And I think, part of the idea of, and this also, I think, goes to Susan's question about why did we break out different targets for the Tahoe Keys and the main lake. And part of that is because we're trying to be as specific as possible to identify where, and specific as possible on where we're making progress, and separating out those individual goals that we can say, yes, we've achieved our first goal, but we haven't achieved our second. And if we start putting them all together, then it feels like you're more likely to end up in this world where it's just like, no, we haven't achieved our goals. But then the threshold evaluation report leaves all sorts of nuance of like, well, we actually achieved sub goal 1, but not sub goal 2. Sub goal 3 is halfway there. And ideally, it's a more straightforward report that's actually providing you with actionable information that says, okay, you're doing well outside the keys, but we're lagging inside the keys. And it actually motivates actions in the area that we're not seeing that progress.
Mr. Chairman? Can I ask a process question?
Please.
So I think on the agenda, we're in planning matters 5A3. And I would suggest that there seems to be direction from the commission that staff go back and work on some of the issues that have been raised. I think Jennifer's suggestion of a 2 East Week session seems appropriate. And that if we can wrap this piece up and get on to the other two, I think we've clearly, as the APC is wont to do, gotten in the weeds and given some good direction, thoughtful direction to staff. So maybe we conclude this part of the discussion and move on to 5A1 and 2 as a logical next step.
I think that makes sense. Yeah, and I think this is really good discussion because this is obviously very important and we care about it as much as you do, or maybe not quite as much, but almost. But I think just quickly on your last point, Dan, I agree, but we don't want to set thresholds up just so our report looks good and it's easy to attain them. And I know that's not what you're suggesting, but I think we just need to be careful when we say things like, we don't want to set too lofty of a goal so that we're always out of attainment. And I don't think you said that, but I just want to make sure that that's not what the public heard.
And I just want to clarify, that is not, if that is what I said, it's not what I intended to say. And, you know, there's 4 thresholds on the table before you today, 4 proposals. At least 3 of those will be out of attainment for the near future. And 1 is, we're kind of on the margins for. So these are, you know, they are aspirational goals intended to drive additional management for the betterment of the region. The distinction I was drawing is where our plans stand relative to achieving those. Because I think all 4 before you today, we do have reliable plans that we believe, if implemented, will achieve those standards.
Thanks, Dan. Mr. Marshall, or Mr. Hester, sorry.
Yeah, this is partly jumping to 102, but partly I think what might help with this. If you look at planning legislation across the board and then you look at TRPAs, most others, in fact, none I know of have thresholds. You look at what a threshold is defined as, it's defined as a environmental standard carrying capacity, environmental carrying capacity standard. That makes them special and a lot more important than goals. The regional plan has a lot of goals, things like housing that we don't have thresholds on. So I think what we need to do is probably make sure that they really are closer to really, really important standards that, you know, a carrying capacity threshold is one that if you don't attain it, there's failure of the system. We have a lot of stuff that isn't going to create failures of the system that we call thresholds. So we probably need to define those. Those are in a very special place above the goals and policies of the regional plan. Regional plan should make sure we do that, but it does some other things. So I think we want to think about defining them that way and not defining them as this is, we want to put thresholds out because we have a plan to get to them. And I don't think Dan was saying that. I think it's more along the lines of what I just talked about coming out of the legislation.
Thanks, John. I think you're right. Are we good to move on? To TYC or SEZ? Whichever is next for you.
Next slide.
Yeah, if y'all are ready, I think we're ready.
Thanks for,
No, I
thanks for
appreciate
hanging
all
in
the
there with
dialogue.
us.
I will try to move quickly. Next slide, please. Sorry, yeah. So the next one is stream environment zones. Next slide. So I included this just in case. So stream environment zones is a bit of a weird term. It's unique to Tahoe. It basically means it includes more than just wetlands and riparian areas. It includes anything that's basically influenced by water, subsurface, or on the surface. Next slide, please. So there are 4 current thresholds that relate to stream environment zones. So the first relates to preserve existing naturally functioning SEZ. The second is restore 25% of disturbed, developed, or subdivided. Third, restore all disturbed SEZ and undeveloped, unsubdivided areas. And finally, attain a 5% increase in total functioning area of SEZ. So we believe the development controls in the regional plan, both in ours and implemented by partners, provide broad protection against degradation of not just naturally functioning SEZ, but any SEZ within our region, even if it has been degraded. The second one has been primarily the focus of the threshold evaluation and the partnership's efforts. And we are likely to attain that target this year. So it's a big milestone for our region. The third has been identified. This is restore all disturbed SEZ and undeveloped, unsubdivided. We've never had a good map of those, so it's never been possible to determine status determination. And the fourth has already been attained. Next slide, please. So this is a negative quote from the 2015 threshold evaluation that basically says our approach to or implementing or improving SEZ amounts to little more than measuring the amount of SEZ within our region. Next slide, please. And this is basically, that's not something we didn't know already. So that was written in 2016. The partnership in 2012 developed the SEZ roadmap that had previously identified this shortcoming in our overall SEZ management program. This focused solely on the area of SEZ. Next slide, please. And to address that, we, along with other partners, had applied to the EPA for a Healthy Watersheds grant in 2017. We convened a technical advisory committee of numerous partners in the region. And then Mr. Drew and others helped us work through how we actually address this shortcoming. And the shortcoming I'm specifically referring to there is ignoring the quality of the SEZ and just saying, we're going to count any SEZ as SEZ, and then we're just going to ignore its quality. Next slide, please. And so because we're Tahoe, we didn't pull just any rating system off the shelf. We developed our own rating system that we thought would be uniquely appropriate for the context here. And basically that rating system includes up to 9 different measurable parameters that were assessed for all SEZ within our region. The actual number included for any individual one depends on the type of SEZ. So there's a lot of different types of SEZ within our region. We don't include all of these for each. And then each of the individual metrics gets a unique score or gets a score. And then that is aggregated up to a score that reflects the condition and function of that SEZ within our region. Next slide, please. So then for each individual SEZ gets a score. It's then multiplied by its area, which provides the overall contribution of that SEZ to our regional SEZ function. And then we add up the entire score of all SEZs. We rate each individual one. We rated about 98% of the SEZs within our region. Multiply it by the area of that SEZ, and we arrive at an overall score that captures both the quantity and quality of stream environment zones within our region. Next slide, please. All of that information is available on our region-wide SEZ dashboard. So you can click on that dashboard and you can see the individual scores. You can see pictures of each SEZ. You can also see who collected the information. So a lot of partners contributed to this effort in measuring different parts of the SEZ's quality. And so we provide all of that information on the dashboard. Next slide, please. So we compiled all of that information onto a single spreadsheet that also contained assumptions about the relative effectiveness of restoration projects or enhancement projects on the individual SEZs, and asked numerous partners within the region to provide or to identify projects that they thought were essential for pushing forward the state and quality of SEZ within our region. We compiled all of those into a single score or into a single composite project, which established what we are proposing as the new goal for stream environment zones within our region. Next slide, please. And so where that goal stands today, so that the current status of all of our SEZ, we believe we're at about 79% of regional SEZ function. Sorry, not just function and extent. And the goal is to move that up to 88% through implementing the identified projects. Maybe just pausing here for a moment, because I think I want to highlight something that Susan mentioned before about how we set these targets. And I think also our approach to these. So this is the second iteration of setting a restoration target for stream environment zones within our region. And the reason the partnership thought it was important is we're about to achieve the first goal that we set for ourselves. And admittedly, that goal was set over 40 years ago. But as a partnership, we realized the work wasn't done, and there's a lot of potential benefit from continuing restoring stream environment zones within our region. And so this is an opportunity to go back and say, okay, we've hit this first target, or sorry, we're about to hit the first target. I'm preempting the celebration that would occur, but we're about to hit this first target. So let's now actually establish a new, more aggressive target, because we realize more is possible and there's a lot more in the works. And I think, this is how the system is intended to work, where once you've achieved a target, you take a step back and you look at, where do I stand today? Is our work done in this regard? And should we be moving on to something else, or is there more to be done? And collectively, the sentiment was there actually is more to be done. So let's establish a new target and see if we can achieve that. And so that's the proposal before you today. That was my attempt at going faster through this one. And I believe that is the last, yeah, perfect.
Dan, just a clarification on that map that you showed. I really couldn't find any color code key. I tried to understand the map as far as the SCZ zones.
Yep.
And there's lots of areas in different colors, and there doesn't appear to be a key that I could see.
That sounds like a bug. I'll address that.
Okay, thank you.
I have a couple just quick ones. I don't want to bog us down too much. So from going from 79% to 88%, that can be achieved two ways, as I understand it. One would be increasing quality, but the second is increasing quantity of SEZ, since there is an extent component. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And my second question is, I assume you did, but the California Rapid Assessment Method, CRAM, is an established standard for evaluating SEZ statewide. Did you look at that and consider that when you decided upon TRPA's custom method?
So we did look at CRAM. The basis of really our overall protocol is based in CRAM, and it adds a couple individual elements. And then we also use a different rating scale than CRAM uses. So part of the CRAM scale, as you'd imagine, there's a lot more degraded wetlands around California. And if you look at Tahoe overall, it just looks like we're amazing. And part of what we wanted to do through this rating system was actually provide some differentiation that could be used for prioritizing individual projects. So our rating is a little bit stricter than CRAM's in terms of the categories we put people into, but for the most part, it's the same metrics.
Thanks, Dan. Jennifer?
Thanks. And Dan, I appreciate that last part of the discussion that you ad-libbed there. Because it definitely helped. I mean, as I was reviewing this, it looked to me like we were losing measurable goals, like what we have that's just about to be achieved, and we're going to celebrate that. And so I appreciate the fact that that you've said, yeah, we're achieving it, or we're about to achieve it. And so how can we do better? So that was a piece that was sort of missing for me as I was reading through this. What isn't super clear to me, just because I haven't fully digested how your math is going to work, is to the new proposed threshold, if it still promotes project level goals. And in some respect, I wouldn't want a small project small in acreage with smaller water quality benefit to just be bypassed merely because it won't move the needle very much. So I think we might just want to be sensitive to that as we think about this threshold and how it will really work, to make sure that the projects that could be important are still promoted and still make a difference, if that makes sense. And the other thing I just want to mention before I cede the mic is that when you do the next 4-year report, if this proposed threshold comes into play, the old threshold won't be there anymore. but we can't lose the opportunity to celebrate that. So we definitely want to say, this was the old threshold and we achieved it, yay us. And now this is the new threshold, instead of only having the new threshold and say, hey, yeah, we haven't achieved this yet. So, thank you.
I'll defer to Kim and others on the celebration aspect of the old threshold, because I think there will be one. But I wanted to speak a little bit to the which projects count aspect of it. Because it wasn't just scientists that criticized our old system for ignoring quality. It was also project implementers, because in effect, at the time of the threshold evaluation, TRPA as an agency made determinations that said, was your project restoration or not? And we kicked, actually, by acreage, 2/3 of the work that's been done in our region was kicked out of that assessment. So smaller projects that just thinned trees. So you can think of a lot of the work that the Forest Service is doing on and about Pope Marsh right now have been continually kicked out of the system. And so we actually developed a new EIP performance measure that said enhancement. And it included all sorts of projects that were not counted towards the overall threshold standard. And so the consensus was that by finding this hard line between what is restoration and everything else, and only counting restoration towards the threshold standard, we were actually discouraging those types of projects that, you know, a lot of people are identifying as really necessary. And so the intent of the new standard is that it's a more holistic assessment, so that no matter how small in terms of the incremental benefit of functional gain, that's counted in this system. And so all of those are included. And you still, you know, so it's a similar framework as the AAS one, where you do still get a lot more credit if you're, you know, you're going into an area that's been entirely filled and you're removing that fill and you're restoring the natural hydrologic regime. You get a lot more credit for that than you do for other things. But we think it's now commensurate with that functional gain of that work.
What were the more Tahoe specific monitoring criteria or evaluation criteria that you added to CRAM?
So we've got now, if you go back, sorry, you don't need to go back. So fish passage was, so SEZ is a broader term than CRAM. So there's a little bit of issue there in terms of like the systems that are covered by each. So, you know, one example would be fish passage, because we're also trying to do stream segments within ours. And so that was identified as core to the function.
Gotcha. And on the functional piece, is this may get into more of the like management planning or regional plan goals, but is position in a landscape or like connectivity to stream channels and things like that factoring into the functional benefit of restoring SEZ A versus B versus C?
So it's not within this framework.
Yeah.
So we have a memo from the Science Advisory Council outlining different ways that you could weight the relative benefit based on position in the landscape, based on what you're trying to achieve. So if you're, you know, like, so you may prioritize undisturbed areas, or you may prioritize areas that are capturing runoff from our urban areas, depending on what your you know, if your goal is wildlife versus your goal is lake protection. But to be clear, those, I don't want to call them discretionary. Those individual priorities are not captured within the overall rating system. It's agnostic to those individual things. I should also, you know, sort of emphasize, Brendan mentioned there's 2 ways to achieve it. There are no individual projects baked into this. The way that the target works is that any project that's implemented is counted towards achieving it, and it doesn't require any individual project.
Thanks, Kevin. Other thoughts? I don't see any hands raised online. I'll just ask, you know, I don't want to take us down a rabbit hole, but is one threshold just all wrapped in enough? Did you have this discussion with the SEZ working group? Do you need other things like how well the SEZ supports biodiversity? There's a million things we could talk about because SEZs are so core to water quality and all kinds of things. you feel comfortable that this is the right way to go? I assume you do, since you proposed it, but.
To be clear, it's not necessarily my proposal, but I am bringing it forward. So if you remember 2 years ago, we'd actually proposed to break it out into two separate things. We'd actually proposed to get rid of SEZ as a term just because it's unique to us. Through the process, both of those were voted down. So we were gonna treat meadows separately from stream systems and just have completely independent ones. We're now working, I think, separately through the stream one. And it's probably just going to be related to water quality, and it'll come through the biodiversity set of our threshold standards. So I think I'm comfortable that the existing, the metrics that we use to rate the condition of the SEZ adequately capture all the individual benefits of the SEZ, and that they provide a framework for discussion of like where we're lagging and, you know, where you may want to prioritize if we notice like biodiversity declines as a result of climate change or something else within our SEZ.
Garth and then Drew.
Dan, could you go back to those criteria, please, on what slide that was?
I can't, but
Or, yeah, I'm sorry, you don't have control.
I think two back. Sorry, one more back, I think. Garth, you're going back to all the individual.
here we go.
Yep.
And so, you know, I noticed in here that, like BMI is not included, right? And so, and basically we're just hearing what you were saying, there's gonna be a separate stream.
BMI is included. The biotic integrity, the
okay.
CSCI score is BMI.
Okay.
Sorry, BMI is benthic macroinvertebrates. Sorry, it's, yeah. My weight is included in this as well.
Dan, if I could just mention, I think, I know where some of your questions, where that question was going. What might help is, one of the things that was a challenge with SEZs, because we've talked about it for a long time, is we essentially had one tool to try and address dozens of issues, problems, challenges, and types of resources. Essentially, and so we had to have all of these threshold standards. There were multiple of them, and they weren't very valuable because they all kind of said the same thing, like just more area is better. And I think what we've done now is, by creating this new monitoring and assessment approach, is we've got a whole toolbox to address these different issues. And the only thing I would add to what Dan said is, all of these but one are approaches that are used either in California or other places. So we didn't go out and just randomly select or create from scratch new ones. We did have to tweak them, as Dan mentioned. For CRAM, if you just applied CRAM in Tahoe, everything looks perfect, because the sensitivity of the data that you collect and the way it's analyzed, it makes Tahoe in the top category for everything. It doesn't give the resolution we're looking for. So we just had to take those and tweak them. The one that we had to create, is because it's a nuance to Tahoe, is the ditches and gullies. That's not something in itself that specifically you're going to go find in another methodology, but it has, because of what happened in the 1800s and then what's happened during the 50s and 60s here, it has such a dramatic impact on what we define as SEZs. We had to come up with something that was specific to Tahoe, because there wasn't anything we could go find anywhere else to fit that in. So I think the big picture is that, kind of to both the questions you asked, is we now have the tools that are necessary to adequately evaluate the variety of types of resources we have that we call stream environment zones. We now have the tools to consider and assess all of them. And all of that is put into this one score. So all of those different factors are considered. So even though there's one threshold, it now actually accomplishes far more than the 5 thresholds we had before. And and unfortunately, I have to go to a meeting at 11:30. So, Mr. Chair, I'm gonna have to step out here in a minute.
Okay, well, I guess we'll let you. Garth, were you finished?
Yeah, no, that definitely gives me a little more clarity. The other question I was gonna have is in regards to the habitat fragmentation indicator. And, you know, with the description, it's percent developed. There's also other types of fragmentation that you can have aside from just development within an SEZ. You know, if there's a vegetation management that happens on an annual basis, you can fragment the habitat that way. Is that also looked at?
I don't believe that it is.
Thanks, Garth. Other thoughts? Anyone, any members online? Not seeing any? Final thoughts on SEZ before we go to TYC? Are you feeling good, Dan? Maybe not. We've held you here a long time.
No, I think, well, this seems far more positive. I don't know if you want specific direction here or.
Anyone want to give specific? Sounds like you might, Steve, or?
I'm just asking staff if you had some direction and to carry this forward past the APC or whether this should circle back in any way.
To be clear, this is, today's session really was just for information and feedback.
Okay.
So I think, you know, I got a lot of direction on the first one. We'll be coming back to you for an actual recommendation. We're not asking for recommendations here. So I think I got a lot of direction on the first one in terms of potential
I
modifications.
was asking about this one.
Yeah, this one haven't heard, I don't think, substantive ones.
I mean, Mr. Chairman, I believe, you know, since Jason had a lot of involvement in this and I thought had a very fine answer to the most recent question, that seems to me you're on the right track. And when it comes back, it will look very similar to what we saw today as far as this one goes. Is that an accurate capture?
I think that's right. My question, and I think is answered, you know, I think it's going to be really important to show in the evaluation report, not just a number, like we got to 84%, but to have this background data and for folks to be able to look and go, we're doing pretty well, except for channel stability or whatever, to use these really meaningfully, to tease out those areas where we may not be doing as well, to inform better management actions, but rather than just a number. I just feel like the public, they like watered down things to an extent, but if we just go, we're at 84%, I mean, how people are going to be like, what does that really mean? But this background information is really meaningful.
And I think, you know, the hope is that it's actually also used within the annual prioritization discussions, both at, you know, at the tie and developing the 5-year list, that you can actually have a substantive discussion that's beyond like, I think we should do Ray Meadow this year. You can actually dig down into the individual ones and be like, well, this is the reason and this is my rationale why I think that is the most important.
Mr. Chair,
Agreed.
I think that is a good point. This system allows you to go back and pull out what got you to that number. So if you say we're at 79 now, our goal is 88, and we've gotten, you know, during some period of time, we've gone from 79 to 83, you'll be able to pull out what projects led to that and which of these factors played into it. And I think the other thing that's really important that we couldn't do before is in the past, we've only been able to say, well, we did these projects and we added this much acreage. What we're going to be able to say moving forward, and I think what's really meaningful to land managers, whether that's public agencies or private projects, is in the past, Dan mentioned the term restoration. It's a really loaded term. Those that worked in the field understand that term means a lot of different things to different people. We really actually, we set that term aside and said, we know that this is relevant to the conversation, but we're not going to use it in the development of this. We're going to look at 3 things. Either you create new SEZ that didn't previously exist. You are enhancing or uplifting an existing SEZ, or you're increasing its size. Those are the 3 things that you can do. And in some cases, you can do all 3. You know, the Y is a good example. where the TJ Maxx is. That is historically an SEZ. You are going to touch all three of those if you were to go in, remove that parking lot, remove that building, and do functional uplift and bring what was there previously back to life. You can also go to a place where maybe there's been previous work done in the past where we've had a channel that's been moved and it doesn't have a lot of function or value right now. And you can go in and it exists, the square footage is there, but you can go in and actually restore riparian vegetation or create aquatic habitat. You may not actually change the footprint at all, but you've given it functional uplift and there's value in that. So I would say the levers that are available to land managers, to private projects, to agencies has grown tremendously. And there's lots of ways we can get from 79 to 88, where in the past you had one way. And the best example I can give is there's a project that many people see. If you look right behind Rayleigh's, the Rayleigh Shopping Center here, there used to be the Colony in there. That project was given SEZ restoration acknowledgement when the Colony Inn was removed. I think even the layperson could go and walk that site right now and recognize it's not functioning. That's not a wetland, it's not a marsh, it's not a creek, it's not what we would say is an SEZ. So I think this new system allows us to address so that those situations don't happen in the future, so that we get real tangible on the ground improvements, and we have the flexibility from a regulatory standpoint and an investment standpoint to make the right decisions.
Thanks, Jason. That's good. Just, I forgot one, you don't have a date on your standard. And I just don't know if you need a date, but you don't, just something to think about, like the Keys by 45, you don't have 88 by next year. Just a thought.
Yeah, Jennifer Carr, Garth just walked out, but let the record show. I'm encouraging him to have a sidebar conversation potentially and follow up on that, his habitat fragmentation idea. Doesn't want to do it today, but if he has some other ideas about things that go into habitat fragmentation, I would just, encourage that conversation to occur as you're continuing to evaluate, your proposal on the standard with you too, Jason.
Thanks, Jennifer. TYC, here we come.
TYC, last but not least. Next slide, please. So our current standard for Tahoe Yellowcrest is maintain a minimum of 26 TYC population sites. And I just want to flag, so you can see it looks like we were going along well in 2011, going along well in 2015, and then not doing well in 2019. Next slide. And that might run contrary to what you've heard both from us, from Fish and Wildlife, from the Forest Service and others who've celebrated TYC as a conservation success overall. It was a candidate for listing, and they ultimately decided not to list. So what's going on there? Why are we saying TYC is out of attainment when everyone else is celebrating as a big conservation success? Next slide, please. And part of that is because of the dynamics of the species and the number of population sites that it occupies relative to the level of our lake. So the blue line on this graph is the lake level in an individual year, and the yellow lines or the yellow bars are the number of occupied population sites, TYC population sites. And if you look at that for any period of time, you'll notice something that the yellow bars seem to go up when the blue line goes down. And so what's happening there is that as the lake level is lower in an individual calendar year, there are more population sites, or there are more sites available for TYC to be present in the lake. Next slide, please. And that's something that's been known for years now, at least 15 or 20 years. It's included in both the population or both the conservation strategy for the species, the older one and the updated one. And so the reason that we've had a static goal for our species, for TYC, is that we adopted our standard in 1981. And there was relatively little known about the species at the time or the number of sites that it would occupy in the lakes. There was 3 years of survey data that we had at the time about the species. And that was the most sites we'd seen occupied. So it seemed like a great goal at the time. Next slide, please. That goal is not consistent with how the species is managed today. And this plot, I apologize, is non-legible. But on the x-axis, you'll have the level of the lake, and on the y-axis, you'll have the number of occupied population sites. And what you see is this very strong relationship between TYC, additional sites occupied when the lake is lower and fewer occupied when the lake is higher. Next slide, please. And so the proposed standard is to align our goal with our understanding of the species today. And so the species management strategy establishes individual targets for occupied sites based on the lake level itself. So they define specific lake levels, and you can see those definitions on the screen. The lake is either low, in transition, or high. So the goal when the lake is in transition maintains the same. We want 26 occupied sites. The goal jumps up to 35 occupied sites when the lake level is lower. And when the lake is high, we are shooting for 20 occupied sites now. We've also, the one other nuance of this is a change from an occupied population site to an occupied survey site to better align with how the species is actually monitored and managed. But that's the quick summary of the proposal.
Thank you, Dan. Comments, questions from APC members? Steve?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So have you consulted with other agencies that previously had a different opinion of whether it was to be celebrated or to? I mean, I remember why it was celebrated at the time, because I thought it was going away and it was going to get listed, but it really is a function of the lake level. So
It is, so in development of this, so it went through the adaptive management committee that addresses TYC. And the general consensus is even at low lake levels, we're having more and more occupied population sites because the management has been effective, excuse me. And most people are in support, and several people commented against, our threshold evaluation saying we're out of attainment because it reflected poorly on what has overall been a conservation success.
but the conservation success was defined under a different set of criteria than what we are looking at in this threshold for Tahoe. Yes?
I think that's correct, because so our criteria, the conservation success as defined in the conservation strategy includes all of the information that they had gathered to date. Our criteria for conservation or for threshold success was developed with only 3 years of information. So it's considered so it's considered unrealistic at high lake levels and not ambitious enough at low lake levels.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Other thoughts? Let me look online. Any thoughts online? So that 26 number, remind me, was that the number of populations in when the plant was discovered in 1979, it looks like?
I believe it was the second survey year that had the second of the 3.
And that the 26 number was the number then?
Yeah, it might have been just above the number that they'd identified in one of those years. 2 of the years were actually lower. And then I believe one was just below or at 26.
Okay. So kind of maintaining baseline upon discovery.
Not even baseline upon discovery, because if you'd averaged those, so pretending we didn't know the influence of lake level at the time, it still was a goal for recovery because it was augmenting the average number of sites.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, was the discussion had with the technical folks, you know, do we want more sites? I mean, is that a goal? Are we looking to maintain, or do we want more TYC in the basin?
So the goal is actually to continue the recovery. So you can see they looked at a couple different ways for establishing the target, and actually dropped the lower one as seeming not ambitious enough. Because they think if we continue to implement the plan, you'll continue to see improvements. And so the target reflects that, as opposed to, I believe the last page included analysis where we were talking about the lower standard deviation of the average number of occupied sites. And the idea was to continue to push the recovery efforts and to, continue to implement and push recovery forward to have more sites occupied.
Okay, thank you. Final thoughts here before we go to public comment on all this? Are you feeling comfortable? Do you want to revisit anything amongst those three with us?
I think I've got good direction for modification relative to the first, in terms of exploring where those things live that we're not quite ready to establish a threshold standard for. And I think it's general head nods on the latter two. Is that a correct reflection of discussion?
Sure, Mr. Chairman, there was Jennifer's comment when Mr.
I have-
Hartley was out of the room. You got that?
I wasn't going to read that back, but I
Okay.
have following up with Garth on
right.
habitat fragmentation.
No, and I just wanted to say that I think for TYC here, I think this is a great move, and I fully support it. I mean, it's a lot more realistic. So I just wanted to add that to my head nod.
Nice, thanks, Garth, from a biologist. Okay, I'm gonna thank you so much. I'm gonna move us to public comment on this. Let's see, I'll read this again. To participate in the meeting, go to trpa.gov. In the calendar, click on APC meeting October 11, 2023. There you'll find a link to the public webinar hosted on Zoom. And if any member of the public wishes to address the APC on this item, please raise your hand now by clicking the raise hand button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or by dialing *9 on your telephone, and you will be called upon by a TRPA staff member. For the record, there is no public in the room. So Catherine, anyone online wish to make a public comment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So far, we have one hand raised. Doug Flaherty, if you unmute, you can address the commission.
Thank you, Chair, members of the commission. I want to congratulate those members who were willing to boldly speak up on protecting the lake with regards to including non-plant species in the discussion earlier. I'm really concerned about the way staff attempts sometimes to manipulate these meetings. Wouldn't use the word shocked because nothing shocks me nowadays about some of the things that are happening at TRPA, but quite concerned when it was mentioned that heavens no, we shouldn't create an unachievable outcome. That comment is in favor of your protecting your process. That's not in favor of protecting the lake. If staff can't provide the leadership, the aggressive leadership to make sure this lake is protected, even if they know that it may be unattainable, that is your job to call this out. You're here to protect the lake. You're not here to protect yourselves and your process. Things have gotten really skewed in the way TRPA handles these processes. So anyway, I won't elaborate anymore. There's a lot to do, but thank you to the members today that were bold enough to speak up, and please do not let staff eradicate the main priority, which is to protect the lake. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mr. Flaherty. I do feel comfortable and absolutely confident in TRPA staff and that they have shared goals with us, but we are here to collaborate with them on that. Anyone else, Catherine?
Mr. Chair, there are no other hands raised to comment on this item.
Thank you so much. That concludes agenda item 5. Dan, thank you so much for spending the better part of the morning with us.
Thank you all. Appreciate the dialogue. It's great.
Please, I assume you're coming back to us. So we look forward to that, but if there's any in-between steps, there are a few that we've outlined, but if there's any others that you feel the need for, I would just encourage you to reach out. So,
Thank you.
great. Now, on to item 6, and I'm gonna go over to Mr. Hester for the Executive Director Report, including the Tahoe in Brief Governing Board Monthly Report on page 37 of your packets and upcoming topics.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you've requested in the past, we'll report on what governing board actions have been taking on your recent recommendations. At your last meeting, you recommended the process improvements that Arlo Stockham and the team brought forward, all except for fees, historic review, broadening the charger definition, and peer and expansion and modification clarification were approved. Those other items are going to come back. The fees this month, other items a little later. And in terms of upcoming topics, next month you'll have the other group that you chair, the Tahoe Living Working Group, not to be confused with the TUI SWIG. The Tahoe Living Working Group Phase 2 amendments will be coming to you, dealing with height, density, coverage, and parking, and also the Placer County Tahoe Basin Area Plan amendments. So we should have a chock-full meeting next month. And with that, I'll answer any questions. I'll turn it over to Mr. Marshall.
Thanks, Mr. Hester. Jennifer.
Jennifer Carr, for the record, I just have a question. So we've gotten a couple of emails from an interested citizen about affordable housing and height and a survey that was done and something that sounds like it's related to this upcoming agenda item for next month. Okay, thank you.
That's correct.
Yep, good clarification. Any other questions? Thank you, John. Now to the other John. We'll go to Mr. Marshall for the General Counsel Status Report. And are we going to jump into the open meeting law and conflict of interest requirements presentation?
In just a second.
Okay.
First, I just want to cover a couple of litigation updates. If you remember, we have one piece of litigation that's the Harash versus TRPA case. It has to do with a landowner who got a permit for a pier and the neighbor then challenged that permit. If you remember, there was one of the claims in that litigation was that TRPA's delegation to issue the permit for that shoreline project was delegated to the hearings officer. And so the hearings officer made all the findings and issued the permit. That permit was then appealed to the governing board, and the governing board, did not vote to overturn the appeal or to overturn the hearing officer's decision. And so the appeal was effectively denied. Harash is claiming that that process of delegation is inconsistent with the compact's directive that in their frame of what the compact says, all projects must be heard and approved by the governing board. And so we've been litigating that case. And we just, not just, but about a month ago, received an order from the district court, Eastern District Federal Court in California, that asked us to, all parties to file a brief on whether or not, because the states are the two compacting parties, that they are required to be named as parties to any case that interprets the compact. And there's some case law that talk about how compacts are contracts. And when you sue under a contract, you have to have all the parties to the contract. And by analogizing to that line of contract cases, the question was posed to the parties, are the states necessary parties? There's an abstract part of that, which is great for all us legal nerds who want to talk about civil procedure. But the practical impact of that is that the states, if they're added, usually will claim their 11th Amendment immunity. And so if they're necessary parties and can't be named, then the lawsuit is dismissed.
So what that means is that any challenge that really involves an interpretation of the compact, which a lot of our litigation does, can be subject to dismissal for lack of naming the two states as necessary and indispensable parties. The court issued a recent order that we'd helped draft, requesting that the states come in and give their thoughts on the judge's orders, whether or not they are necessary and indispensable parties. And we're in the middle of that briefing. We should see what the states have to say in a week or so. So that has the potential for, and at no time has any past court when they are, and when we've had litigation that directly involves the meaning of the compact, have directed us or dismissed the case for lack of naming the individual states as parties. You could see how that might be required when, like, there's a compact over water allocation. So let's say the Colorado River Compact, you know, there the state has a proprietary interest in that compact. And so you know that in that instance, it's probably a necessary thing to have all the states present if their interests could be affected by a reallocation or an interpretation of the compact that leads to a reallocation. For these, you know, our compact is more of a regulatory, land use regulatory planning compact. In that case, the interests are a little more opaque or vague as to specifically what might the state have in a proprietary sense, their interest in that litigation. There's hundreds of compacts. And so potentially if there's a broad rule here, that could have substantial impact. We'll keep you posted. Next issue is it's a case now before the Supreme Court called the Sheets case. And it's a takings case that you should kind of watch over the next year. And it's Sheets versus El Dorado County, which is in the, you know, Brendan probably knows the background better than I do, but a legislative fee was enacted to help with the generating funds for improvements that were necessitated by development. It was a legislative fee, so not an individual impact fee associated with the impact associated with that particular project. I think it's probably, was it generic if you?
There's zones.
Yeah.
Certain zones designated in the county that developer, this is called a TIM fee, a traffic impact mitigation fee. So we approve a subdivision essentially, and as part of that approval and development agreement and subsequent action, the developer must build improvements like traffic lights, lane expansions, et cetera, in order for that subdivision to go in, to reduce then increased traffic impacts on the roadways caused by the increased population of the development itself.
So if you guys remember your constitutional history, you've heard the Nolan and Dolan cases that talk about rough proportionality of fees and impact to an exaction that a local government would or governments would take. So like fees, it's an exaction for the privilege of or the right, depending on where you are in the political spectrum, to develop property in a particular way. And California courts have always not applied the Nolan-Dolan analysis to legislative fees. So the question before the Supreme Court is whether or not the California lower courts, which have basically said there does not apply, whether that's a correct application of the Nolan-Dolan analysis. If they overturn the case, then it's going to become more difficult to do these kind of legislative impact fees. You'll have to have a much tighter connection between the actual impact of the project and the fee assessed. So that's, probably the likely outcome, and Brendan can keep us up to date on the development of that. The last case that I want to talk about is Ellery's case. It comes from NDSL's
effort to assess and update their fees for permit fees for buoys and piers in Lake Tahoe. They went through, there was some legislation that said, go ahead and update the fee. Instead of setting a particular fee, the legislature setting a particular fee, this was delegated to NDSL to set a fee. NDSL went through a rigorous process to update fees, and fees were increased from $50 to $100 for buoys, I think.
$30 for a buoy increased to $250.
And then for
$75
piers?
for a pier increased. Sorry, I think it was $150 for a pier increased to $750.
So
Sorry.
depends on how you look at it. It's either a, 200% increase or $50 more for your buoy. And those fees were challenged. They were upheld at the district court, the trial court level, and the Supreme Court recently issued a decision essentially saying, agreeing with the state that there was a lower standard of review for review of regulations as opposed to agency action. So a specific permit is reviewed under an arbitrary and capricious standard of review, and really for regulatory decisions, it's a little lower standard of review saying, is it a possible, reasonable interpretation of the law? Did I get that?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Yes, if an agency's regulation is challenged and goes through judicial review, the standard of judicial review is if the agency is within their statutory authority, the standard of review is not arbitrary and capricious.
So it makes it even, it's easier to pass legislation than and when you're under judicial review for that, than if it's a particular application of a statute in a particular instance. It's still very deferential, but it's even more deferential in this case. So the fees were upheld. There was a little footnote, I think, that also talked about that even if it, given the process the state went through, they were, essentially reasonable in and of it themselves because of the effort that NDSL went through. Would you like to add anything more to that?
I think that's a really good characterization of the opinion that was issued. It's been a long time to get to this decision. And I think it's a reflection on our agency's efforts that we really went through a rigorous process. It's nice to see that acknowledged and upheld. But I think what our DAGs are really excited for, our Deputy Attorney Generals, is that clarification on the review of regulations. So it was considered to be kind of a win-win because of that.
TRPA under our compact has its own standard of review, which is a little different than what the Nevada Supreme Court will apply. They're all pretty deferential, but there's even an additional level of deference when the body is acting in a quasi-legislative capacity as opposed to quasi-adjudicatory. Okay, let's quickly go on to open meeting law. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, if you'll indulge me, I left an item out, and that's a plea for funds from Victoria. So go ahead.
Can you guys hear me all right? Great. Yeah, sorry to cut you off, John. This will just be a little brief interlude here. So hello, everyone. My name is Victoria Ortiz. I'm the Community Engagement Manager here at TRPA, and I'm going to do a brief presentation on our Lake Lapper Environmental Scholarship. And as John said, a plea for some funds. So for those who may not be aware, TRPA sponsors this environmental scholarship every year, and it is supported by voluntary donations from our governing board, our APC members, and our staff. And it's one of several ways that we help support the next generation of those who are interested in understanding and connecting their livelihoods to the environment that supports us. So TRPA, and specifically Julie Reagan, created this scholarship in 2004. And now for nearly 2 decades, it has awarded scholarships to Lake Tahoe seniors on the North Shore and the South Shore pursuing environmental careers. And since its inception, we have had 29 students receive almost $14,000. They are all granted based on academic and extracurricular merit and the desire to pursue a career in the environmental field. Next slide. Thank you. This year, we had 2 amazing students who were each awarded $1,000 scholarships. Evelyn Bennett of South Tahoe High School and Kai Davey of North Tahoe High School. And Evelyn had volunteered with Lake Tahoe Wildlife Care since she was 9 years old. And actually, a lot of staff just went to Lake Tahoe Wildlife Care this morning, and it was amazing. She is an all-star student and athlete, and also carved out time to serve as a student advisory member for the Lake Tahoe Unified School District and assist the local climate crew. And she is now at UCLA pursuing a degree in bioengineering and bioinformatics and plans to go into environmental research. So maybe we will see her presenting on Threshold someday. Kai Davey of North Tahoe High School is now studying biology at UC Berkeley. And at an incredibly young age, he's already demonstrated an impressive dedication to pursuing his intellectual pursuits. He's done original research on how we can use fungi to mitigate wildfires and ensure a continuing food supply for the planet, and worked with one of his professors to do that at the high school. His love for and fascination with mycology inspired the selection committee, and he also served as a biology tutor and clean up the lake volunteer. Next slide. So as I mentioned, funding for this scholarship comes completely from staff, governing board, and APC donations. So in the last few years, we've been really lucky to receive record donations and have already received over $1,000 this year to go towards future students. So if you are inspired to contribute, you can write a check out to TRPA with a memo for environmental scholarship. And I'd ask that you please do that before the November APC meeting. And you can either mail it to the office or drop it off here, and with the attention to myself, Victoria Ortiz, or Maria. So thank you very much. Happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Thanks, Victoria. Any questions for V? Thank you. Back to our regular program with John Marshall.
Back to the mundane drudgery of the open meeting law, which is very important. So we're gonna start. Can you next slide, please? And I'm trying to skinny this down a little bit and direct it more towards where it actually intersects with you all as a, because a lot of the open meeting law obligations come onto staff. And I know that a lot of you have had a significant experience with your open meeting law requirements, either from state level or local levels. So if you have anything to add, please chime in. I'd rather have this to be a group discussion than a lecture going one way. Let's first start with the compact and what the compact requires. So if you remember, the compact is, a federal law that both states enacted as individual state laws, and then was approved by Congress. And it's the first place we look to as to what our legal requirements are. And in Article 3D, it basically says all meetings shall be open, or it does say all meetings shall be open to the public to the extent required by the law of the state of California or the state of Nevada, whichever imposes the greater requirement applicable to local governments at the time such meeting is held. In California, there's 2 different open meeting laws, one for state agencies and one for local agencies. So there is this distinction here. It's also interesting that when the framers of the compact looked at this, they thought TRPA was more like a local land use planning entity than more like a state level agency. And so they wanted more of the laws that really regulated local governments than statewide agencies. And so that forced the agency to look at both the Brown Act, which in California applies to local agencies, and then the Nevada Open Meeting Law, which is the one law that applies to both state and local governments. So that analysis was undertaken, and we've redone it relatively recently as to which state imposes greater requirements. We essentially, they're pretty much similar, in their basic requirements. Nevada open meeting law is a little stricter in terms of its use for closed sessions or executive sessions. And so the determination was made that let's follow the open meeting law of Nevada, which that's what we've been doing ever since I've been associated with the agency. All right, so let's quickly then look at the Nevada OML. So next slide, please. And there's two major goals that, or 2 points I want to make here, that is really the intent is that public bodies take action openly and the deliberations be conducted openly. So transparency, so that the public has a right to know, what information is presented, what the discussions are at governmental agencies, and then to hear the deliberation. And as you'll note, as we'll talk about later, have the ability to comment on those decisions before the decisions are made. And let's move on to the next slide. And really one of the key first determinations is, who does the open meeting law apply to? And it applies to public bodies. And public bodies essentially, and I'm going to apply this, just interpret this for you, to almost every committee or entity or body that's identified in the compact. So the APC, the governing board, and then subcommittees of those two bodies. So we'll have and subcommittees that contain at least 2 members of either the APC or the governing board. So those are our public bodies. Sometimes they're called steering groups. Sometimes they're called official committees. It doesn't matter whether or not they have the a stamp of approval by the governing board. If it's even an informal committee, if it's composed of 2 or more members of a public body that are bringing recommendations forward, and it's not just kind of a one-way information briefing, that becomes a public body. Any questions on that? Yes.
So by that definition, Jennifer Carr, for the record, that would include working groups.
Correct. So TUI SWIG, for all its great name, is just a public body. Okay, what does open meeting applies to meetings? Next slide, please. Meetings of public bodies. And what is a meeting? A meeting basically is when there's a quorum of the body will take deliberation towards an item that doesn't, you don't have to take action, but that is leading towards an action. So that is kind of restrictive in some sense, but you don't want to miss whether your meeting is a public body, or whether your gathering is a meeting or not. So you always err on our side of caution. Almost every time a majority of the APC gets together, it's going to be a meeting. And we'll talk about some exceptions to that. All right, next slide, please. It has to be a majority, okay? But how can you get in trouble with that majority requirement? Thank you for that great transition question into a statement into serial communications. So you can create a majority by accident through particularly emails, where all of a sudden you start circulating emails amongst one member sends it to another member, that member forwards to another member, and you have all of a sudden, instead of what's allowed, which is maybe, a one-on-one or 3 people talking with each other, you're into a serial meeting or a walking quorum. It was first that people met actually physically and, in 2s and 3s and passed on that information until a quorum of that body had participated towards, had deliberated towards an action. And now it's can happen electronically. And so those are the the area I want to focus on for a second is both emails and texts or any electronic communication or telephone calls that create a quorum through the serial meeting issue. And you really need to be careful about that. So you need to limit and you need to watch if you have a communication that starts to spread just beyond this small group of individual members of a public body. To be safe, stop at one and basically say, you know, don't forward that communication, or be careful when you see that communication is forwarded. And if you have any questions, talk to me. And we can work through, you know, if there's an issue or not. With a lot of these issues, and particularly when we get into conflicts of interest, my mantra will be just give me a call or send me an email saying if we got something going on. Okay, next slide, please. So again, here's some exceptions that we can talk about just quickly. Social functions are not meetings. There's no deliberation or action, and you're basically gathered socially. So at a Christmas party, a holiday party, or a training session, those are not meetings that you're actually deliberating towards something, even though it meets that first test of a quorum of members that are gathering. By law, attorney-client closed sessions are not considered meetings. It's kind of a useless distinction as whether it's a meeting or a approved closed session. In California, it's considered to be a meeting, but you know, it's a reason to go into executive session. In Nevada, it's actually considered not a meeting, but you get to the same place. So this group doesn't really, you know, we don't really have the need to go into closed session very much, but I just want to let you know that there is that possibility. Next slide, please. We take care of this for you. So I'm going to just quickly talk about this. Basically, open meeting law requirements. You have to provide notice and an agenda of what's going to happen. So we're going to talk a little bit about first the timing. It has to basically be 3 days in advance for the open meeting law for Nevada. The compact requires 7 days. So it's more generous to the public, who often complain that I'm sure you hear in your own lives that there wasn't enough time to digest the materials, the reams of materials that you might get on something. So the TRPA compact requires more working days than either of the two state laws, I believe. You have to provide the locations where the notice was posted. You have to provide contact information, and you have to provide an agenda. Next slide, please. The agenda, again, we take care of this for you. So just talk really quickly. You need to say what you're going to be talking about. So it provides people with notice, if they have an interest in that subject matter, that they can come listen and participate. And it has to be a clear and complete statement. It can be brief, but it has to provide notice of, so what you see in our agendas, kind of a topic area. If there's a code chapter that's being affected, put the code chapter down, and then you need to essentially say whether or not there's going to be action taken. Next slide, please. And so here's some just thoughts about whether or not this is clear and complete. By the way, I'm going to admit right up, I should have done it the first thing, that a lot of these slides are just taken out of the Nevada Attorney General's training on the open meeting law. I think we can kind of pass through this one and go on to the next minimum public notice requirement. And there's two things that we want to talk about here is the first bullet really, which is where do you provide notice? You still in some sense need to provide physical notice, but mainly notice now is provided online at websites. For the state of Nevada, there is a clearinghouse that you can provide your notice. Since we're not a state agency or a local government of Nevada, we don't participate in that. But that is, another noticing opportunity. Next slide, please. Meetings must be able to be attended by a range of the concerned public. And so you have to make reasonable efforts to assist and accommodate those with physical disabilities desiring to attend. You must make reasonable efforts that the meeting location is adequate for a reasonable number of people to attend. You can't have one chair out in the audience with a lot of people interested in seeing what's happening. You need to be careful about providing alternative viewing locations. You can do that, but you still have to have some capacity for people to actually observe what's going on. And you must make copies of the agenda notice and supplemental materials available to the public. Next slide, please. So closed sessions in Nevada can be undertaken in a very limited number of circumstances. Since you all don't have you're lucky that you don't have to deal with personnel matters, really. The first one's not really relevant. I think really the only one that's relevant here for the APC is the non-meeting closed session for legal advice. So if, for example, if there's a time in which all of a sudden we need to take a closed session in the middle of a meeting and it's not agendized, we can do that under Nevada law because it's a non-meeting. You couldn't do it in California because you have to agendize those things. We may have, particularly if I feel like you're really going astray, we may, say, hey, let's take a quick break and go into closed session and talk about the litigation risk that's happening here. Next slide, please. So just quickly, again, really not for you, but closed sessions can't be held to discuss the appointment of any person to a public office. So that's why at the you'll see at the governing board level, the two governing board direct hires, the executive director and the agency counsel, general counsel, those interviews process really have to be conducted all in open session, which makes it awkward. But that's because we're acting consistently with the open meeting law of Nevada. Public comment, next slide, please. Public comment is really important to the business of government. It allows the public to have direct input to you all, decision makers or people who are making recommendations. And so that means that you must provide an opportunity for public comment, and it must be meaningful. So what does that mean? It essentially, under the Nevada open meeting law, you have to provide an ability to comment once generally and prior to any action being taken. So there's different ways you can do that. You can provide a public comment meeting, a public comment notice at the beginning of the meeting, or at the end, or at each individual action item. You don't have to provide a public comment period for informational items. We often do, but you don't have to do that. So for example, after the agency counsel or the report of the executive director, we don't have to have public comment on that. But you have to have a general public comment period at the end of the meeting. I think I got a little ahead of myself here.
John, can I ask a question?
Yes,
How does this differ for California?
it's basically the same.
Basically the same. Thank you.
Now let's talk about restrictions on public comment. You can have reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. So that means 3 minutes per person instead of an hour or unlimited. It means that you can essentially limit the total time of public comment. But what you can't do is limit public comment based on the content of the speaker. And so even if it's objectionable, you can't limit that kind of public comment. So if it's defamatory, if it's highly controversial or highly confrontational, generally you have to sit appropriately and hear that public comment. If the comment is such that it can be construed as disruptive, which includes highly inflammatory conduct or speech, then it can be shut down. Generally, it has to be pretty bad before you get to that point.
Does that include hate speech?
Yes, except, so we had a recent example of this at Placer County,
El
Dorado County, with anti-Semitic language. It becomes difficult to really determine if it's getting disruptive or not. So, and I think in that case, your county council essentially let those comments proceed. It's almost better to err on hearing those comments than risk the potential remedies that are associated with a violation of the open meeting law.
Can an agency create a policy, say on hate speech, where they could then cut those off sooner?
I think that's a developing area of the law. I'm sure your council is looking at that. I would say what you need to be looking at is what's the linkage between the disruption of the meeting, the physical, and while it doesn't have to be physical action, but is the meeting substantially disrupted by the speech? If it is, then state, basically First Amendment law allows the public agency to cut that comment off. But where that line is a difficult one to say.
I think that there's been new I'm sorry. I think there's been new legislation in California related to this. Are you aware of that?
I can't say that I'm directly
Okay.
aware with it, but remember that where you can have state legislation, but what really the applicable law is the First Amendment of the US Constitution. So that's what you have to, in freedom of speech, which we highly prize. And we want the ability of people to be irritants. And we have, as government decision makers and government employees and officials, we have to listen to those wide perspective of views and hear, even though it's problematic sometimes to listen to what people are saying.
And would there be a requirement that people that are on Zoom particularly identify themselves? So that you
No,
can, so there's no way to know whether or not those people, for instance, thinking in the Board of Supervisors meeting, whether or not those people were actually residents of El Dorado County and were able to make these comments.
Correct. You can be anonymous. You can't have the requirement to identify specifically the speaker. You can ask, and you can have on your sign-up sheet, a name, but you can't deny someone the ability to speak. You can't precondition that ability to speak on identification. But what you can do, and what we've had an issue with is, and the city has as well, people signing up with obscene names. And you don't have to put yourself in a position where you are, where the clerk, for example, of the APC has to read out an obscene name. Right. That is, kind of having then a government employee essentially being co-opted into that role. But what you need to look carefully on that, and what we're actually now reviewing our own policies, is there a way to identify that speaker with some other character or some other identifier, a number that person can know if they ever raise their hand, that they can be identified and called
Mr. Chairman, John, thank you. So all that being said, there is some new language that the chairman reads in the beginning, such as today, that does allow for or does prohibit certain types of speech.
Yes. But where that line is.
I understand.
And we can stop someone when their conduct is such that is going beyond just speech and creating a disruption.
Right. Okay. Because, I think maybe that was the first time you read that today.
Yes.
So more agencies seem to be doing that because there are unfortunately folks out there that push the limit, I guess.
Yes, that's true.
Can I ask, sorry, can a hearing body leave the room during inflammatory or hate speech? So that the speech continues, excuse me, but they are not present at the table to hear it. I heard maybe that was an option.
I'll need to look into that. The problem that you'll have with that is loss of your quorum. That if you're not there participating, have you lost a quorum and then you've got to restart the meeting when you come back in and you have your quorum. That would be the issue that I would need to look at. But it's a good point. I mean, really the issue that you're bringing up is, do public servants need to subject themselves to hate speech, for example? That balance though is, at what point does those individual members' sensitivities overcome your governmental role and your obligation to allow people their First Amendment rights in this manner. But a government provided forum in this manner, but it can be regulated. So that's I think I'll look into that and try to get back to you on that one. Thank you.
The bill that I'm referring to is Senate Bill 1100, which was passed on January 1st, 2023.
Thank you.
Can the chair suspend the meeting?
Yes, but if it's done to deny a person their First Amendment rights, then it becomes problematic. If it's suspended for 5 minutes because, people are being riled up and then, the chairman makes or the chairperson makes, instruction to say, we have to hear this. There's a way that you can manage your meeting and, it's a developing area of the law because of, I think, some of the coarseness that has, entered our public dialogue.
John, this is Kate Lois O'Neill. I just have a question. I have seen this in the past. Can a board member or the chair specifically offer someone more than 3 minutes?
The problem with that, and let me just repeat what I think you asked because it was hard to hear. Can you allow more than 3 minutes? The answer is yes, but you have to be consistent. You can't allow, let's say, a proponent of the policy you're in favor of more time than an opponent. So if it's a one-off, it becomes difficult. So generally, our legal advice is everyone gets exactly the same. You can add a little bit of extra time, but you have to provide that same flexibility to all of your public commenters then. So
that makes sense. Thanks, John.
Okay.
One more.
Yeah,
All right.
so just to clarify what Steve said, the new language in our opening statements as chairs doesn't limit the content of the comment. It only limits our staff from having to read the name if it's obscene, slanderous, or offensive. So they can, as long as they're still just Tom Smith, they can still say obscene, slanderous, or offensive things. They just can't sign in to Zoom with a name that's, so, yeah. One thing that hopefully it would never come to this, but I don't I haven't put my eyes on the law, but it's been my understanding over time as a public employee that we do not have to be subject to threats. So if a comment provided threats, I think we can shut it down because then that's an actionable offense. for the
Correct.
Attorney
Then
General.
then it becomes disruptive. So, you know, again, it's going to be a judgment call as to whether or not when something shifts from obscene to a threat. And so, you know, the classic case of, you know, a draft resistor walking into high school with, you know, F the draft. That was protected speech. But if you're trying to force somebody to say that, becomes something different. Or if you're then take that into a threat to someone, to a particularly like a draft board or something, then that's, you know, something that you can, that is not covered by the First Amendment. Okay, should we cruise on? This is, I mean, I think today has been a great discussion. Thank you for all your participation. All right, let's go on to the next slide, please. Yeah, I think we've talked about this. And that last bullet is what we were just talking about, is when you can remove somebody or shut down a meeting when it becomes disruptive. Let's quickly go, next slide, please, to TRPA's teleconferencing and video conferencing meetings and participation. These are our own rules. The OML has slightly different requirements, as does the Brown Act. And these are the rules for the governing board. I would suggest that we may want to work with the chair and vice chair to see if what rules we want. If we want to, you know, the APC has their own ability to change the rules for them. But basically, you can now you can participate remotely from any location. Remember, before there was some, we had some rules about where you had to be in the state or in the jurisdiction that you represented. The governing board capped themselves with, you can only do it 5 times per year. We still want to encourage in-person participation. Here we already ran into this, the rule that I'm, you know, I'll help you with for which items can be roll call, or which have to be roll call versus by acclaim, is basically what we call substantive items, particularly at the governing board level where there's a vote count that needs to be satisfied, like a dual majority, a bi-state majority, or a public project vote that has to have a certain number. We need to have those done by roll call. And we have to allow the public an opportunity to participate remotely. So in this day and age, coming out of COVID, we essentially said that was good policy. We want to maintain that. That's now required by both states.
We've added language to our board agendas, something to the effect of public participation remotely cannot be guaranteed. You know, if you really want to be heard, show up in person. It's something to talk about, like power outages or internet failures or things like that as a coverall. So that was added, I know, in the last month or two for us.
Okay, it's good to know.
Yeah.
And Jennifer and then Garth.
Yeah, there was another amendment to the open meeting law that we're picking up on in some of our commissions now. I'm trying to make sure we're complying with, that has certain requirements for things you have to read at the beginning of the meeting for that public to participate. I think our opening statement largely covers that, but we should double check that to make, you know, if we have to like read out the phone number, like 775, blah, 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 blah. That might be part of it now, but it's too recent for me to be able to cite perfectly.
We went through this, we went through this in the planning commission, and I believe in California, the location has to be open to the public. Because we had one commissioner. And where he was staying was going to be open to the public.
Right. We have that, we do not follow that.
Yeah, John, question for you. Could you clarify with the remote participation capped at 5 times per year? Is that as for the body as a whole, or is that per individual?
That's per individual.
Okay.
So it's to limit the number of times that a member participates remotely. To try to encourage
Their presence.
in-person participation.
Great. And this applies to the APC as well currently, correct?
Yes. Have we decided that it's not going to be? I should know the answer to this one, Steve.
Mr. Chair, so didn't you just say that it doesn't yet apply to the APC, but we want to consider having it apply?
Let's assume that it applies, and then we're going to talk with the chairs about what it is that they want.
Okay. I think
Because
that-
there's a
I think
general.
we said the
there's a-
same thing in different ways.
Yeah, there's a general rule that in our rules of procedure that says the governing board policies apply to the where applicable, apply to the APC unless the APC makes a different rule.
Got it. Okay, thank you. And then, isn't there some recent legislation, I don't know, or some, because there was a concern about people having to identify where they were as a safety issue potentially for that person. If somebody said, okay, so-and-so is going to be in this location at this particular time, I don't like that person, I'm going there. Isn't there some recent legislation or writing or legal interpretation on that? I don't know. I'd heard that and I'm just asking.
I'll have to look at that, but we don't require that.
Okay. You don't require the
Identification
yeah.
of the location.
Yeah. But the city, I think, does. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
And I won't force you guys to go back to the first slide, but remember that what the open meeting law or what the compact says is that you shall follow directions of the local government action for, let me get the language right. All meetings shall be open to the public to the extent required by the law of the state of California or Nevada. So the key phrase is that all meetings shall be open to the public. And then it qualifies how that should be done. It doesn't say follow the open meeting law of the states. It says for this particular purpose, follow the open meeting law. So we've always interpreted that as says the agency has the ability to create other rules that are not directly are not directed at which meeting should be open. Right. So our noticing is different. Or when we provide the newspaper notices, that's an additional requirement that we have. And so we have resisted some OML requirements because they are not necessarily directed at which meeting shall be open. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Is there next slide? Okay. So that I believe that ends our, oh no, we have one more violation slide. I'll go ahead and just speak to it. So what happens if there's an open meeting law violation? Now, what's the remedy? And the basic remedy is that the action taken can be voided. And so the consequences are severe. And under state law, particularly under the open meeting law for state agencies, and I wanted to get that compact provision read before I talked about this. You can request, a member of the public can request a investigation by the state AG. And the state attorney general can then basically direct the local government to take some action. So that's also, that either undoes the action taken, provided sufficient notice if that was the issue, and then you retake the advice or retake the action. And so really we need to be careful about complying with the open meeting law and the open meeting law requirements.
Is there potential for legal action against any of us as individuals rather than a collective?
I believe in both state laws, there are potential civil and criminal penalties associated with deliberate violations of the open meeting law. Again, I would argue on your behalf that those rules aren't applicable to TRPA. If it turns out that you actually were acting in a deliberate fashion to circumvent the open meeting laws, you know, our action would be probably to recommend that the board remove you, or, you know, take some action regarding, you know, the fact that it was deliberately done. Okay, next slide, please. We're moving on to ethics. I think we have one slide before that. No, did we take that slide out? That it just had compact article 3A5? Okay. All right, I'm sorry. Maybe we reversed the order. I have it different in my handout. So let's talk about ethics. So ethics is really conflicts of interest. And under the compact, the conflicts of interest are directed at pretty much economic interests. And so there's disclosure requirements, and then the basic requirement is you can't act on an item that, and I'll use my interpretation here, can be perceived as contrary, may not actually be, but give the appearance of a conflict of interest. So generally the APC deals with quasi-legislative actions. So broad policy or specific rules that rarely single out your particular interests. So example, if your interest is diffuse or common with other members of the public, then it's not a distinct enough issue to preclude you from a regulation, even though it might have an impact on your economic interests. So let's talk about allocations of, you know, development or something. And, you know, many of you own property in the Tahoe Basin, and there may be an action that you would take on a legislative basis that affects those interests. If it's shared by many members and the public at large, then you can still participate. It's not concrete enough of an impact on you. However, for example, Kevin, if we were to look at a zoning amendment that looks specifically at, you know, one of where your brewery is, that would, you know, basically say no alcohol sales allowed. That would be such a specific enactment where you would probably have to take yourself, recuse yourself. But really we're focusing on economic interest. There's a whole nother body of law that we are concerned about that's outside the compact that also is, you know, it's basically constitutional due process protections. And that really comes into focus when you're acting in a quasi-adjudicative fashion, which you all don't do very often. Because that's when you're applying a particular facts to, let's say, a permit issuance. You'll do it when an EIS comes to you on a particular project. So we might have some different leagues. Okay, we just lost a quorum of members, so we're now in a non-meeting, but we can continue. Actually, what I suggest though is we have a public interest comment period when I finish up, which hopefully will be really quickly, even though we're in a non-meeting situation. Thanks, John.
Hey, point of clarification, don't we have 8 members here?
Yeah, and that's not a quorum. So we only have 1 online. So we've been tracking the numbers. We have 9, which is not a quorum. Clear quorum is
22 total. Isn't it a simple majority?
Yes. So 9
22
is
total members.
You need, right. So we generally we run off 20, And so we go with 10. But it really should be 11 because that's the majority of 20.
Got
But
it.
now we're down to 9, so we don't have a quorum. Okay, we talked about next slide, ex parte. We talked about the distinction between quasi-legislative and quasi-adjudicative. Let's talk about ex parte contacts just really quickly. Ex parte contacts are when you are contacted or you make contact with a member outside of a member of the public outside of a meeting. It can be an agency, another agency, or it's just someone who's not a member of TRPA. And in quasi-legislative matters, we want to encourage ex parte contacts. That means you're going out to the public, you're soliciting input, or they're contacting you. And so it's a good thing. We want you to do that, and therefore you don't need to disclose ex parte contacts in quasi-legislative matters, which is 99% of what you all do. However, for quasi-adjudicative matters, our code and rules of procedure and compact require disclosure. You don't have to abstain necessarily if you have a contact with, let's say, an applicant, but you need to disclose that prior to taking action. Okay. All right, let's go on to the next slide, please. And that's it.
Can you just define adjudicative?
Yes, sorry.
I didn't learn that.
It's hard to say. It's basically comes from an adjudication. And what an adjudication is, when it's also another way to say it is quasi-judicial, or it's when there's an application of law to a specific factual circumstance. So when a permit application comes forward, for example, and it comes to a body, that's a quasi-adjudicative act because you're looking at the specific application of rules to the facts of a specific request. Quasi-legislative action is making up of the rules in the first place. So you're acting more like a legislator than a judge. Okay. Garth.
Thank you, John. Could you provide an example of when you said 90%, 99% of the time we're quasi-legislative, and then the 1% of the time quasi-adjudicative? Can you give us an example of when we would take action with that?
Probably a recommendation on certification of an EIS for a project.
Okay.
Right?
Yes.
Because that's a specific related to, does this project meet our environmental requirements?
Even though we're not approving, we're just recommending approval to the governing board?
Yes. So that is an action that you're taking, and that recommendation is still considered an action that, realistically, we want public. I mean, just think about it. You would want to know if someone has an economic interest in that recommendation.
Of course. Thank you.
And we need to think about it, I think all of us have a day job, right? Separate from this. We're not just, say, a board member on El Dorado County, that's their job. So when we talk to someone, we have to remember, do we have our day job hat on, or do we have our APC hat on? Right? It's a little more complicated.
These rules don't apply to, there's still, conflict of interest rules that apply to staff. But obviously the disclosure rules are different. Though if you are, let's say you're at your desk at El Dorado County and someone calls up and says, I want to talk to you about vacation rentals. If we were in a situation where we had somehow an EIS for a project that had vacation rentals as a part of it, then I would encourage you to disclose that, even though it might have been a contact that you thought was related to El Dorado business. But that's just being safe. But for the most part, when you're acting, for the government representative here, when you're acting in your everyday jobs, these rules don't apply to you because you're not a member of a decision-making body in that capacity. Okay, so I think we're done, and we can go on to next agenda item.
Thank you so much, John. That was really helpful. Yeah. We might want to review that on some regularity every few years or something. Or as major changes come up, please let us know. Keep us in our lane. Do I need to do anything different now that are we in a meeting or out of a meeting or?
We're out of a meeting. So I would just proceed to public comment, even though.
Okay.
Just provide that opportunity for folks.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to move us on to item 7, public interest comments. This is the closing public interest comment period. If any member of the public wishes to address the Advisory Planning Commission, please raise your hand now by clicking the raise hand button at the bottom of your Zoom screen or by dialing *9 on your phone, and you will be called on and unmuted by a TRPA staff member. As I mentioned before, any unheard comments can be submitted via email to publiccomment@trpa.gov. Please include the meeting information and agenda item in the subject line of your email. Please note the Advisory Planning Commission is prohibited by law from taking immediate action on or discussing issues raised by the public not listed on our agenda. And for the record, there is no public in the room to make comment. Catherine, over to you for general interest closing public comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have one hand raised so far. Doug Flaherty, if you unmute, you can address the commission.
Thank you, Chair, members of the commission. Briefly, always enjoy Mr. Marshall's information on the open meeting law. And maybe someday when he retires from TRPA, he can work as a college law professor. I think the students would greatly benefit. Just one concern, because I'm not aware of any regulation that required council to brief the ACP on the open meeting law. It seems like I read something somewhere, but I guess my comment would be concerned that we were missing a significant number of members during the general meeting, which means that they missed this briefing, which is of paramount importance, as far as transparency in government and those types of things. So what also concerned me a little bit more was that we had obviously one person drop out just before the ethics and quasi-legislative discussion was happening. So I just want to go on the record that if there was a requirement that this information be shared with the APC by council, that they had received a board packet that explained or had in content of the board packet all the slides that were presented by Mr. Marshall. And I guess if there was a requirement to brief APC members and members are missing, will there be another briefing on the open meeting law to those members that missed it? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Flaherty. I think that's a fair comment. We can, John, I don't know if you want to respond, or we can talk offline to ensure that if there is an actual requirement for this training, that the members not present do receive it.
There's not a requirement in our compact or our rules, but we'll provide the handout to all APC members.
Great. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair, there are no other hands raised to comment on this item.
Thank you, Catherine. Okay, thanks again, John. I'm going to move us on to item 8, which is adjournment. I do just want to disclose, we don't need to adjourn.
You're no longer in a meeting.
We're not in a
there's
meeting.
Nothing to adjourn.
We don't need to adjourn, but